December 7th, 1941, will come like a thunderclap. But the lightning that precedes it strikes first on a warm California evening in September 1924, inside a small hotel room in San Francisco, where a 53-year-old Japanese diplomat named Masao Inoue sits alone, staring at a letter he will never send. The letter is to his daughter in Tokyo. In it, he tries to explain why he has just resigned his position after 28 years of service. He writes about the Immigration Act, passed 3 months earlier, the one that declares his people unworthy of American soil. He writes about the man on the streetcar who spat on his shoes and called him a yellow monkey. He writes about the moment he realized that no amount of polite bows or flawless English would ever make him American. Then he folds the letter, places it in his breast pocket, and walks to the window. Below him, the lights of San Francisco twinkle in the darkness. He thinks about the American warships in the harbor, their decks spotless, their guns gleaming. He thinks about the Japanese ships he once served on, smaller, older, but filled with men who would give their lives for an empire that just lost its last chance at peaceful expansion. He does not cry. He simply watches the lights until they blur, and then he turns away. Masao Inoue is a fictional man, but his humiliation is real, and it burns inside millions of Japanese who will never forget that America looked at them and said no. The camera drifts back through time, or perhaps forward, to the muddy streets of Tokyo in the summer of 1923, 1 year before Inouye's resignation, when a different kind of disaster reshapes the Japanese soul. On September 1st, at 2 minutes to noon, the Great Kanto earthquake turns the capital to ash. The camera holds on a single image, a wooden geta sandal, still tied with cloth, lying alone in a sea of black mud. Its owner is gone, swallowed by the fires that burn for 3 days and claim over 100,000 lives. In the aftermath, rumors spread like disease. Koreans, it is said, are poisoning wells and setting fires. Mob justice follows. The camera shows hands, ordinary hands, shopkeepers and farmers, seizing men and women by the hair, beating them with bamboo poles, leaving bodies in the streets. The American ambassador cables Washington with words that will echo for decades. The Japanese people have shown themselves capable of terrible things when fear takes hold. But America does not act on this observation. America sends money for relief, $19 million, more than any other nation. The Japanese accept it with deep bows and polite smiles. They remember the money. They also remember the chaos. They remember what fear can make a people do. Now the camera moves to a factory floor in Osaka, 1929. A girl named Hana, 14 years old, works 16 hours a day at a spinning machine, producing silk thread for export to America. Her fingers are raw, her lungs filled with cotton dust, her wages barely enough to buy the rice porridge that keeps her alive. She has never seen an American, but she knows they wear the silk she makes. She knows they drive cars with tires made from rubber she will never touch. She knows that when the stock market crashes in New York, thousands of miles away, the orders stop, the factory gates close, and she is sent back to her village with nothing but the clothes on her back. In her village, her father sells her younger sister to a brothel in Shanghai to pay their debts. Hana will never forgive America for this, though she cannot explain why. She only knows that distant forces with names like Wall Street and tariffs and embargoes, reached across the ocean and took her sister away. She is not a character in a history book. She is a wound that will not heal. In the winter of 1931, the Japanese army invades Manchuria without authorization from the civilian government in Tokyo. The camera shows a young Lieutenant Takeda leading his platoon through the frozen fields north of Mukden. His breath freezes in his mustache. His men are exhausted, hungry, but they do not complain. Takeda believes he is liberating Asia from Western domination. He believes that Japan's destiny is to lead, to unite, to build an empire that will treat Asians with dignity, unlike the British in India, or the Dutch in Java, or the Americans in the Philippines. He has never been to India or Java or the Philippines. He has only read the pamphlets distributed by his superiors, pamphlets that speak of co-prosperity and racial equality, and a sacred mission. When his platoon enters a village, he sees the faces of Chinese peasants staring at him with hollow eyes. He tells himself they are grateful. He tells himself they will understand someday. He does not notice the woman holding her dead child, killed by stray artillery fire the night before. He does not see her because he has been trained not to see. The camera lingers on her face and then cuts away. Takeda will die in the Solomon Islands in 1943, still believing he was right. In Geneva, 1933, the Japanese delegation walks out of the League of Nations Assembly. The camera focuses on the shoes of the lead delegate, Yosuke Matsuoka, as he descends the marble steps. The shoes are polished to a mirror shine. The steps are cold. Outside, reporters shout questions. Matsuoka says nothing. He gets into a car and drives away. The League has condemned Japan's occupation of Manchuria. Japan responds by leaving the organization forever. Alone now, completely alone, the empire turns inward. In Tokyo, crowds celebrate. They wave flags and sing songs. A university student named Kenji watches the parade from his dormitory window. He is 20 years old, studying political science, and he feels a thrill in his chest that he cannot explain. He wants to be part of something great. He wants to serve. In 4 years, he will be an officer in the Imperial Navy. In 8 years, he will stand on the bridge of a destroyer south of Pearl Harbor, watching planes take off for the attack. He will remember this day, the day Japan stood up to the world, and he will believe until his last breath that he fought for something noble. The years between 1933 and 1937 pass like a fever dream. Assassinations rock Tokyo. Young army officers, convinced that politicians are weak and corrupt, murder cabinet members in their homes. On February 26, 1936, snow falls on the capital as 1,400 troops seize the city center. They hold government buildings for 3 days, demanding a restoration of imperial rule. The rebellion fails. Its leaders are executed. But the message endures. The military will not be controlled. Civilian politicians learn to speak softly when generals are in the room. The camera shows a meeting of the cabinet in early 1937. The Prime Minister, a frail old man in a Western suit, proposes diplomatic engagement with the United States. A general interrupts him, slams his fist on the table, and shouts about national honor. The Prime Minister says nothing. He looks down at his hands. The general gets his way. This scene repeats across dozens of meetings, hundreds of decisions, thousands of small surrenders, until the civilians stop speaking altogether. On July 7, 1937, A shot rings out near the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing. Who fired it? The Japanese blame the Chinese. The Chinese blame the Japanese. The truth is irrelevant now. Within weeks, full-scale war engulfs the continent. The camera follows a column of Japanese infantry marching through the North China Plain. They pass fields of kaoliang, a tall grain that rustles in the wind like whispered secrets. They pass villages emptied of men, only women and children left behind. They pass a ditch filled with bodies, flies swarming over open mouths. The soldiers do not look. They have learned not to look. One of them, a farmer's son from Kyushu named Yoshida, writes a letter to his mother that he will never mail. In it, he tells her about the stench, the constant stench of death that follows them everywhere. He tells her about the dreams he has at night, dreams of his hands covered in blood that won't wash off. He tells her he is sorry, though he does not know what he is sorry for. Then he folds the letter and puts it in his pocket, next to the photograph of his mother standing in front of their rice paddy, smiling. Shanghai falls after 3 months of brutal street fighting. The camera shows the aftermath from above, a cityscape of shattered buildings and smoke. Then it drops to ground level, to the Bund, where foreign businessmen stand on the balconies of their clubs watching the Japanese flag rise over the customs house. They sip gin and tonics. They discuss insurance claims. They do not intervene. In Nanjing, the horrors defy description. The camera does not flinch. It shows the bodies clogging the Yangtze River, hundreds of them, thousands, floating toward the sea. It shows the faces of women who survived, their eyes empty, their mouths silent. It shows a child sitting alone beside a dead mother, too young to understand why she won't wake up. The world will call this the rape of Nanjing. Japan will call it a fabrication. The camera holds on the child's face for a long, terrible moment. This is not politics. This is not propaganda. This is what men do to other men when they believe their cause is just. In Washington, President Roosevelt reads the reports from his diplomats in China. He sets down his cigarette holder and stares out the window. He wants to act. He wants to stop the flow of American oil and steel that fuels this slaughter. But isolationist sentiment runs deep. Congress will not support sanctions. The American people, still recovering from the Depression, do not want another war. So Roosevelt does what he can. He issues moral appeals. He urges American companies to voluntarily stop selling to Japan. Most ignore him. Profits matter more than principles. The oil keeps flowing. The steel keeps shipping. The slaughter continues with American blessings and American materials. By 1939, the war in China has become a bottomless pit. The imperial army controls the cities, but the countryside belongs to guerrillas. The camera follows a supply convoy, struggling through the mud of a rural road, trying to reach an isolated garrison. The trucks burn gasoline at an alarming rate. Every gallon comes from America. Every gallon costs money Japan does not have. In Tokyo, finance ministry officials stare at balance sheets that show the country bleeding foreign currency reserves. They project forward. At current consumption, the reserves will last 2 years, maybe less. Then the war stops. Then the empire dies. They present their findings to the military. The military listens politely and ignores them completely. The generals have their own plans. They look south, always south, to the oil fields of Borneo and Sumatra, to the rubber plantations of Malaya, to the rice paddies of Indochina. The resources are there, waiting. The only obstacle is the Western powers who control them. In the summer of 1940, Germany conquers France in 6 weeks. Holland falls even faster. The news reaches Tokyo like an electric shock. French Indochina and the Dutch East Indies are now orphans, their colonial masters defeated and occupied. The resources sit there, undefended, ripe for the taking. Japanese diplomats pressure the Vichy French government to allow troops into northern Indochina. The French, powerless, agree. The troops move in. The camera shows them crossing the border, their faces tired but determined. They believe they are securing Japan's future. They do not know that every step south brings them closer to war with the strongest nation on earth. Roosevelt watches these moves with growing alarm. In the spring of 1940, he orders the United States Pacific Fleet to remain in Hawaiian waters indefinitely after its annual exercises. Then, in May, he makes the decision permanent. The fleet moves its base from San Diego to Pearl Harbor. The camera shows the great warships sliding into their new berths, lines of gray steel against the blue Pacific. The message is clear. America is drawing a line. Japan must not cross it. But the line is drawn in water, and water moves, and Japan is already moving with it. July 1941. Japanese troops enter southern Indochina, occupying bases within striking distance of Malaya, Singapore, and the Philippines. Roosevelt responds with the heaviest weapon short of war. He freezes all Japanese assets in the United States. He imposes a complete oil embargo. No more shipments. No more negotiations. No more chances. The camera focuses on a single man in the Navy Ministry, a mid-level officer named Yamamoto, no relation to the famous admiral. He receives the cable and walks slowly through the corridors to deliver it to his superiors. His footsteps echo on the wooden floors. He passes portraits of naval heroes, paintings of great victories, models of battleships in glass cases. He reaches the door of the conference room and pauses. He can hear voices inside, arguing, planning, hoping. He knocks. The voices stop. He enters. He hands over the cable. The senior admiral reads it, and for a long moment, no one speaks. The only sound is the ticking of a clock on the wall. 18 months, the admiral thinks. 18 months of oil reserves, and then nothing. Then darkness. Then the end of everything they have built. The camera pulls back, rising above Tokyo. Below, the city hums with life. Trains clatter along elevated tracks. School children in uniforms walk home from classes. A vendor sells sweet potatoes from a cart, his voice rising in the familiar street cry. A young couple strolls through a park, holding hands, laughing at something only they can hear. None of them know what has just happened. None of them know that their country has been given an ultimatum disguised as a policy. Surrender China, surrender the empire, surrender everything they have fought and died for, or go to war with a nation whose industrial output dwarfs their own by every measure that matters. There is no third option. There is no face-saving compromise. There is only the clock ticking down toward the morning of December 7th, 1941, when the first bombs will fall on sleeping ships and the world will change forever. And in that moment, in that unbearable pressure, the path becomes inevitable. The only questions that remain are when, where, and how. The when will be December. The where will be Hawaii. The how will be written in blood and fire across the waters of a harbor that, on this summer day in 1941, still sleeps in ignorant peace under the Pacific sun. In the port of Yokohama, on a gray morning in October 1940, a 52-year-old tugboat captain named A.G. Saito watches an American tanker slide slowly into its berth. The ship is called the SS Connecticut Sun, and it carries 200,000 barrels of crude oil from California. A.G. has worked this harbor for 34 years, since he was a boy of 18, with calloused hands and dreams of becoming a ship's officer. He knows the smell of oil, the way it hangs in the air like a promise or a threat. He knows that without this ship, and the dozens like it that arrive each month, Japan stops. The factories go silent. The warships stay in port. The airplanes become sculptures of metal and canvas, beautiful and useless. A.G. does not think about geopolitics as he guides the tanker to its mooring. He thinks about his son, Hiroshi, who serves as a petty officer on a destroyer somewhere in the South China Sea. He thinks about the letters Hiroshi writes, letters full of vague descriptions and careful omissions. He thinks about the oil in this tanker, the oil that will be refined into fuel for his son's ship, the oil that keeps his son alive by keeping his son moving. He does not know that within 12 months, the SS Connecticut Sun will make its last voyage to Japan. He does not know that the American government will soon freeze every asset his country owns, including the money that pays for this oil. He only knows his job, and his job is to bring the tanker in, and he does it well. The camera pulls back from A.G.'s tugboat and rises above Yokohama Harbor, revealing a panorama of industrial civilization. Cranes line the waterfront like steel dinosaurs, loading and unloading cargo from around the world. Warehouses stretch for blocks, filled with American scrap metal, Australian wool, Indian jute, Malayan tin. Railroad tracks spider outward from the docks, carrying these materials to factories across the home islands. Smokestacks belch columns of smoke that merge into a single gray canopy over the city. This is what empire looks like when it works. This is what empire looks like when the resources flow. But the flow depends entirely on the goodwill of nations who have no reason to wish Japan well. Now the camera moves inside a cramped office at the Imperial Navy's fuel department, where a 41-year-old civilian engineer named Kenji Miyazawa sits hunched over a ledger book, his glasses slipping down his nose, his fingers tracing columns of numbers that tell a story no one wants to hear. Kenji graduated at the top of his class from Tokyo Imperial University in 1923, the year of the Great Earthquake. He has spent his entire career studying fuel consumption, fuel reserves, fuel logistics. He knows more about Japan's oil situation than any man alive, and what he knows keeps him awake at night. The ledger before him shows the latest figures. Japan consumes approximately 4 million barrels of oil every month. Domestic production, mostly from the small oil fields on the island of Honshu, amounts to less than 100,000 barrels. The rest comes from imports, and 90% of those imports come from the United States. Kenji does simple math in his head, the kind of math that terrifies him. If the Americans stop shipping, Japan has approximately 24 months of reserves, assuming immediate rationing. But rationing means the Navy stops training, the Air Force stops flying, the economy starts to choke, and after 24 months, nothing. No oil, no options, no empire. Kenji closes the ledger and removes his glasses, pressing his fingers against his eyelids until he sees stars. He has presented these figures to his superiors a dozen times. Each time, they nod politely, and tell him he is doing excellent work. Each time, nothing changes. The generals and admirals have their own sources of information, their own experts, their own numbers. Some of them believe Japan can seize oil in the Dutch East Indies before the reserves run out. Some of them believe the Americans are bluffing. Some of them simply refuse to believe that Japan, the land of the rising sun, the divine nation, could ever be brought to its knees by something as mundane as a fuel shortage. Kenji knows better. Kenji knows that warships without fuel are just floating coffins. He puts his glasses back on and opens the ledger to start the calculations again, as if doing them one more time might somehow change the answer. The camera shifts to a different kind of office, this one in Batavia, capital of the Dutch East Indies, in the spring of 1940. A Dutch colonial administrator named Peter van der Heyden sits at his desk, reading a cable from The Hague that informs him Germany has invaded the Netherlands. His hands tremble slightly as he sets down the paper. He has served in the colonies for 22 years, building a life, raising a family, administering the extraction of oil from the fields of Sumatra and Borneo that make the Royal Dutch Shell Company one of the most profitable enterprises on earth. Now his homeland is occupied, his queen in exile, his future uncertain. He looks out the window at the orderly streets of Batavia, the Dutch-style buildings, the Javanese servants walking bicycles along the canals. He thinks about the oil fields, hundreds of miles away, pumping millions of barrels every year. He thinks about the Japanese diplomats who have been visiting with increasing frequency, asking polite questions about production capacity and shipping schedules. He knows what they want. He knows they will come for it eventually. He writes a letter to his wife, who is visiting relatives in Amsterdam, though he knows she will never receive it. The mail service has stopped. The world has turned upside down. Peter van der Heyden will spend the next 18 months trying to hold things together, trying to keep the oil flowing to the Allies, trying to delay the inevitable. In March 1942, he will watch from the window of an internment camp as Japanese soldiers march into Batavia, their flags waving, their faces impassive. He will spend the rest of the war in a prison camp, surviving on rice and hope, and he will never see his wife again. In Tokyo, the military planners study maps of the Dutch East Indies with the intensity of men studying their own survival. The camera shows a map room in the Navy Ministry, where officers trace the coastlines of Borneo and Sumatra, marking the locations of oil fields with colored pins. Balikpapan, with its refinery and deep-water port. Tarakan, smaller, but strategically vital. Palembang, the jewel, producing 70% of the region's oil. The officers speak in low voices about landing beaches, garrison strengths, expected resistance. They calculate distances, fuel requirements, shipping capacities. The numbers are brutal. To seize the oil, they must commit the bulk of their fleet, the bulk of their merchant marine, the bulk of their army. To transport the oil back to Japan, they need tankers they do not yet have. To defend the oil once seized, they must hold a perimeter stretching thousands of miles across the Pacific, a perimeter that includes the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, the Carolines, the Marianas, and eventually the Philippines, Guam, Wake, and the Bonins. The officers know this is risky. They know the Americans will not simply watch them take the oil. They know war with the United States is the logical conclusion of this path. But they also know the alternative, and the alternative is surrender without a fight. surrender of everything they have built, surrender of their nation's destiny. One officer, a captain with steel-gray hair and tired eyes, looks at the map and speaks quietly to the man beside him. He says that Japan is like a patient with a terminal illness. The treatment might kill him, but doing nothing definitely will. The other officer nods. Neither of them smiles. There is nothing to smile about. Now the camera moves to Washington, D.C., to the office of Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, a man with a bald head and a permanent expression of moral outrage. The date is July 25, 1941. Ickes signs a document that will change history, though he does not know it yet. The document authorizes the suspension of all oil exports to Japan, effective immediately. Ickes has been pushing for this for months. He has called Japan an aggressor nation, a threat to peace, a violator of every international norm. He has argued that American oil is fueling Japanese atrocities in China, that every gallon shipped to Yokohama comes back as blood on the streets of Nanjing. Now finally, with the Japanese occupation of southern Indochina, Roosevelt has given him permission to act. The camera watches Ickes' pen move across the paper, scratch, 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 the sound impossibly loud in the quiet office. He sets down the pen and leans back in his chair. He feels satisfied. He feels righteous. He does not feel the weight of what he has just done, the chain reaction he has triggered, the bombs that will fall because of this signature. That weight will come later, much later, when the casualties are counted and the historians assign blame. For now, he simply signs, and the oil stops. The news reaches Tokyo in the early morning hours of July 26th, Tokyo time. A night clerk at the Foreign Ministry receives the cable and reads it twice before the meaning fully penetrates. Then he runs, actually runs through the darkened corridors, his footsteps echoing off walls decorated with portraits of emperors past. He bursts into the office of the Vice Minister, who has been sleeping on a cot in his office for 3 days, waiting for exactly this news. The Vice Minister reads the cable, his face pale in the lamplight. He tells the clerk to wake the Foreign Minister. Then he sits down heavily and stares at nothing. He thinks about his son, a student at Kyoto University, studying literature. He thinks about his wife, who worries constantly about money and status and the family name. He thinks about the cherry trees in his garden, just beginning to bud. He thinks about oil he has never seen, oil that comes from a place he has never visited, oil that now determines whether his son will live or die in a war that has not even started yet. The Foreign Minister arrives in his pajamas, his hair disheveled, his eyes still heavy with sleep. He reads the cable. He does not speak for a long time. Then he says 2 words, quietly, almost to himself. So it begins. In the weeks that follow, the full impact of the embargo becomes clear. It is not just oil. It is steel, scrap metal, aviation gasoline, machine tools, copper, lead, zinc. Everything Japan needs to fight a modern war, everything Japan does not produce in sufficient quantity, everything that comes from America, stops. The camera shows factory floors across Japan, where production slows, then stops altogether. It shows workers standing idle, their tools silent in their hands, their faces confused and angry. It shows managers holding meetings that go nowhere, issuing orders that cannot be fulfilled, staring at inventories that shrink day by day. It shows housewives lining up for rationed goods, their baskets empty, their children hungry. It shows old men in parks reading newspapers that shout about American aggression, American arrogance, American hypocrisy. And it shows young men, thousands of young men, enlisting in the military, with a fervor that surprises even themselves. They want to fight. They want to strike back. They want to teach America a lesson it will never forget. They do not know that America has 10 times their industrial capacity, 20 times their oil reserves, 100 times their potential for destruction. They only know that they have been humiliated, and humiliation requires revenge. The camera finds Kenji Miyazawa again, the engineer from the fuel department, on a rainy evening in September 1941. He sits in his small apartment in Tokyo, alone, reading a letter from his brother who lives in Los Angeles. His brother writes about the hostility he faces on the streets, the suspicion, the fear. He writes about the Japanese-American community preparing for the worst, storing food, canceling trips, saying goodbye to friends who might never return. He writes that he still considers himself American, still loves the country of his birth, still hopes this madness will pass. Kenji folds the letter and places it in a drawer beside his bed. He thinks about his brother, his only living relative, 7,000 miles away. He thinks about the probability that they will soon be enemies, that his brother might be imprisoned, that they might never see each other again. He thinks about oil, always oil, the liquid that moves the world and destroys it. He lies down on his futon and stares at the ceiling, listening to the rain beat against the window. He does not sleep. He will not sleep well again for many years. In the Dutch East Indies, the oil fields continue to pump, unaware of the drama unfolding around them. The camera shows the facilities at Balikpapan, a complex of derricks and pipelines and storage tanks spread along the coast of Borneo. Dutch engineers supervise Javanese workers who perform the dangerous, dirty labor of extraction. The oil comes from deep underground, ancient sunlight captured in porous rock, pumped to the surface, and processed into fuel that powers the modern world. The engineers know the Japanese are coming. They have heard the rumors, seen the reconnaissance flights, read the intelligence reports. They have begun preparing demolition charges, wired to destroy the facilities at a moment's notice. They do not want to destroy them. They have spent years building them, maintaining them, improving them. But they would rather see them burn than fall into Japanese hands. A young Dutch engineer named Johannes de Vries walks the perimeter of the refinery one night, checking the charges, testing the connections. He thinks about his wife, pregnant with their first child, waiting for him in Batavia. He thinks about the child he might never see, the life he might never live. He finishes his inspection and walks back to his quarters, the lights of the refinery glowing behind him like a promise or a threat. In 4 months, Japanese paratroopers will drop from the sky, and Johannes will have minutes to decide whether to run or die or press the detonator that turns years of work into ash. The camera returns to Tokyo, to the Imperial Palace, where Emperor Hirohito receives regular briefings on the situation. The emperor is a small man with glasses and a receding chin, a marine biologist by inclination, a divine sovereign by birth. He sits in a room decorated with screens depicting scenes from Japanese mythology, listening to his advisors argue about war and peace, survival and honor, oil and steel. He speaks rarely. When he does, his voice is soft, almost inaudible. He asks questions about the chances of success, the risks of failure, the morality of action. His advisors give him answers that reassure without committing, that flatter without informing. The emperor knows they are protecting him from the full truth. He does not know whether to be grateful or resentful. He looks at a map of Southeast Asia spread across the table before him, a map dotted with Japanese flags and American bases and British colonies and Dutch possessions. He thinks about the oil beneath those maps, the oil his empire needs to survive. He thinks about the men who will die to seize that oil, the families who will mourn, the children who will grow up without fathers. He thinks about his own children, safe in the palace, unaware of the catastrophe gathering around them. He closes his eyes for a moment, and when he opens them, the map is still there, the flags are still there, the oil is still there, waiting. In the final weeks before the attack, the oil question dominates every conversation, every calculation, every dream. The camera shows a naval officer writing a letter to his wife, telling her he will be away for a while, not to worry. He will come home soon. He does not mention the oil, though oil fills his thoughts. He does not mention the American tankers that once filled Japanese harbors, now absent, now gone forever. He does not mention the reserves dwindling day by day, the clock ticking toward zero, the pressure building toward explosion. He writes about the weather, the food, the comrades he serves with. He writes about his love for her, his hope for their future, his certainty that everything will work out. He seals the letter and hands it to a sailor, who will mail it from whatever port they reach next. He does not know that he will never see his wife again, that his ship will sink beneath him in the Coral Sea, that his body will feed fish instead of returning to the soil of his homeland. He only knows that the oil is running out, and something must be done, and he is part of whatever comes next. And so, as autumn 1941 fades toward winter, Japan makes its choice, not willingly, not eagerly, but inevitably. The oil embargo has left no room for compromise, no space for negotiation, no path to survival, except through war. The camera shows the final cabinet meeting where the decision is formalized. The faces of the men who will be remembered as villains or heroes depending on who tells the story. They sign documents. They exchange formal bows. They leave the room one by one, each man alone with his thoughts, each man carrying the weight of what they have just done. Outside, the streets of Tokyo are quiet, the citizens unaware that their leaders have just condemned them to years of fire and death. A street vendor packs up his cart, counting the day's meager earnings. A mother calls her children in from play. A young couple walks hand in hand beneath the autumn leaves, in love, alive, ignorant. And in the harbors, the oil tanks sit half full, waiting for the ships that will never come, the shipments that will never arrive, the future that will never be. In the darkness before dawn on July 28, 1941, a 43-year-old harbor master in Saigon named Tran Van Min stands on the dock, watching the largest military convoy he has ever seen slide silently into the mouth of the Saigon River. Tran has worked this harbor for 20 years, through French colonial rule, through the collapse of France, through the arrival of Japanese inspectors, who now control every aspect of port operations. He has seen cargo ships and passenger liners, naval vessels, and fishing boats. He has never seen anything like this. Transport ships stretched to the horizon, their decks crowded with troops, their holds filled with tanks and artillery and ammunition. Warships guard the flanks, destroyers and cruisers with guns trained on the shoreline, watching for threats that do not exist. Tran lights a cigarette with trembling hands and watches the first troops disembark as the sun rises over the Mekong Delta. They are young, most of them, with faces that have not yet learned to hide fear. They carry rifles and packs, and the certain knowledge that they are part of something enormous. Tran does not know where they are going or what they will do. He only knows that his city, his country, his life will never be the same. He stamps out his cigarette and walks back to his office, where a Japanese officer waits with new orders and a smile that does not reach his eyes. The troops pouring into Saigon belong to the Imperial Japanese Army's 25th Army, 40,000 men under the command of Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita, a 56-year-old officer with a shaved head and a reputation for brilliance that makes his superiors nervous and his subordinates devoted. The camera follows Yamashita as he walks through the streets of Saigon on the second day of the occupation, observing his troops, noting the condition of the roads, the attitudes of the French colonial officials who still nominally govern the city, the faces of the Vietnamese who watch from doorways and windows. Yamashita knows why he is here. He is here to stage. He is here to prepare. He is here to launch the invasion of Malaya and Singapore, the jewel of the British Empire in Asia, the fortress that everyone says cannot fall. Yamashita has studied Singapore for years. He knows its guns point south toward the sea, expecting attack from that direction. He plans to attack from the north, through the jungle, through the impossible terrain the British consider impassable. He plans to prove them wrong. He stops at a street corner and watches a platoon of his engineers examine a bridge across a small canal. They move with precision, with purpose, with the confidence of men who know their trade. Yamashita nods to himself and continues walking. In 4 months, these same engineers will build the roads his tanks need to roll into Singapore. In 5 months, the British will surrender in the greatest humiliation in their military history. But that is still in the future. For now, there is only Saigon, and the heat and the waiting. In Washington, the news of the Saigon landing arrives like a slap across the face. President Roosevelt reads the intelligence reports in his study at the White House, a room cluttered with ship models and naval memorabilia from his time as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He knows what this means. Southern Indochina is not a defensive move. It is not about securing resources for the war in China. It is a staging ground for further aggression, a dagger pointed at the heart of Southeast Asia. Malaya lies to the southwest, with its rubber and tin. The Dutch East Indies lie to the south, with their oil. The Philippines lie to the east. American territory. American responsibility. Roosevelt sets down the reports and lights a cigarette, his long holder clenched between his teeth. He thinks about the phone call he received from Winston Churchill the previous night. The British Prime Minister's voice, heavy with concern about the vulnerability of Singapore. He thinks about the cables from General MacArthur in Manila, warning that the Philippines cannot be defended without reinforcements. Japan's move makes impossible. He thinks about the American people, still divided between those who want to help Britain and those who want to stay out of the war entirely. He thinks about the election of 1940, the promises he made to keep American boys out of foreign wars, the political reality that constrains every decision he makes. He takes a long drag on his cigarette and reaches for a blank sheet of paper. He begins to draft the order that will freeze Japanese assets and impose the oil embargo. He does this knowing it might lead to war. He does this knowing the alternative, letting Japan seize Southeast Asia unopposed, might lead to something worse. He signs his name and hands the paper to an aide. The aide leaves. Roosevelt stares out the window at the Washington Monument, white against the summer sky. He does not know that he has just made war inevitable. Or perhaps he does know, and signs anyway. The camera moves to a small village in the mountains of northern Malaya, where a 28-year-old rubber tapper named Ahmad bin Ismail sits in his hut, listening to the BBC on a battery-powered radio his brother smuggled from Singapore. The reception is poor, crackling with static, but Ahmad can make out enough to understand that Japanese troops have moved into Indochina, that the British are worried, that war might be coming. Ahmad has no love for the British. They rule his country, take its resources, treat its people as inferiors. But he fears the Japanese more. He has heard stories from Chinese merchants who fled the war, stories of massacres and atrocities, of cities reduced to ash, of women dragged screaming into trucks. He looks at his wife, sleeping on a mat beside their children, her face peaceful in the lamplight. He thinks about what he would do if soldiers came, if they tried to hurt his family. He has no weapon, no training, no hope of resistance. He turns off the radio and sits in the darkness, listening to the jungle sounds, the insects and birds and small animals that go about their lives unaware of the catastrophe gathering beyond the horizon. In 4 months, Japanese troops will land on the beaches of northern Malaya, and Ahmad will flee south with his family, joining the river of refugees that clogs the roads leading to Singapore. He will never return to his village. He will never tap rubber again. He will spend the war years in a crowded camp, surviving on rice and hope, waiting for a liberation that will not come until 1945. In Tokyo, the military planners study the American response to the Indochina occupation with the intensity of gamblers watching the dealer's hands. The camera shows a room in the Army Ministry where officers pore over cables from Washington, translating each phrase, analyzing each nuance. The American note is harsh, demanding, uncompromising. It calls for Japan to withdraw from Indochina immediately, to abandon its alliance with Germany and Italy, to accept the open-door policy in China, to renounce its ambitions for regional hegemony. The officers read these demands and feel their faces flush with anger. Who are the Americans to dictate terms? Who are the Americans, with their immigration laws and their racial slurs and their oil embargo, to tell Japan how to conduct its affairs? A young major, newly assigned to the planning section, stands and walks to the window. He looks out at the city below, at the millions of Japanese going about their daily lives, unaware that their future hangs in the balance. He thinks about his father, killed in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, a war that established Japan as a power to be respected. He thinks about what his father would say if he could see his son now, watching the Americans push Japan toward a corner with no exit. He turns back to the table where the debate continues, voices rising and falling, arguments circling back on themselves. No one mentions the obvious truth, that Japan has walked into a trap of its own making, that the occupation of Indochina was supposed to strengthen the empire but has instead united its enemies, that every step forward brings them closer to a war they cannot win. The camera shifts to a very different room, This one deep inside the Imperial Navy's headquarters in Tokyo, where Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sits alone at his desk late at night, studying maps of the Pacific. Yamamoto is 57 years old, small even by Japanese standards, with broad shoulders and a prosthetic hand from wounds received in the Russo-Japanese War. He is known as the most brilliant strategist in the Navy, a man who studied at Harvard, who served as naval attaché in Washington, who knows America better than any other officer in the Japanese military. He also knows, with a certainty that keeps him awake night after night, that war with America would be a catastrophe. He has told his superiors this repeatedly, in meetings and memos and private conversations. He has warned that Japan cannot defeat the United States in a prolonged conflict, that American industrial capacity dwarfs Japan's, that the only hope is a short, sharp war that forces America to negotiate. His warnings have been heard and ignored. His counsel has been solicited and dismissed. Now, with the occupation of Indochina and the American embargo, war is no longer a possibility, but a probability. Yamamoto looks at the maps before him, at the vast distances of the Pacific, at the American bases strung like beads across the ocean. He knows what must be done. Japan must strike first, strike hard, strike at the heart of American power in the Pacific. It must destroy the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, cripple American ability to respond, buy time to seize the resources of Southeast Asia and fortify the perimeter. He does not want to do this. He believes it will ultimately fail. But he is a soldier, and he has his orders, and he will do his duty. He picks up his pen and begins to draft the operational plan that will become the attack on Pearl Harbor. The pen moves across the paper, line by line, word by word, writing the future in ink. In the Dutch East Indies, the oil fields continue to pump, but the atmosphere has changed. The camera shows the refinery at Balikpapan on a sweltering afternoon in August 1941, where Dutch engineers work frantically to complete the demolition preparations. They have placed explosives at key points throughout the facility, wired them to detonators, run the wires to command posts, where men wait with hands on switches. The engineers know that if the Japanese come, they will have minutes to destroy everything they have built. They know that destroying the refinery will deny the Japanese its output, delay their war effort, give the Allies time to regroup. They also know that destroying the refinery means destroying their own work, their own lives, their own reason for being here. A senior engineer named Hendrik van Dyke walks through the facility one last time, checking the charges, testing the connections, saying goodbye to the machines he has maintained for 15 years. He pauses at the control room, where gauges and dials monitor the flow of oil through the complex. He thinks about the first time he saw this place, fresh from technical school in Amsterdam, full of dreams and ambitions. He thinks about the woman he met here, a Javanese nurse who became his wife, who gave him children, who made this strange land feel like home. He thinks about the children, half Dutch, half Javanese, who will never be accepted in Europe or Asia, who will spend their lives caught between worlds. He finishes his inspection and walks back to his quarters, passing Javanese workers who bow as he goes by. They know what the explosives mean. They know what is coming. They say nothing. There is nothing to say. In Tokyo, the diplomatic clock ticks toward 0. The camera follows the Japanese ambassador to the United States, Kichisaburo Nomura, as he walks through the streets of Washington on a warm September evening. Nomura is 63 years old, a retired admiral with a gentle face and a sincere desire for peace. He has spent months negotiating with Secretary of State Cordell Hull, trying to find some compromise that would satisfy both nations. He has failed. The gap between Japanese demands and American requirements is simply too wide to bridge. Nomura stops outside the Japanese embassy, a handsome building on Massachusetts Avenue, and looks up at the flag waving in the evening breeze. He thinks about his wife, still in Tokyo, who writes him letters full of news about their children and grandchildren. He thinks about the cherry trees in their garden, the ones he planted when they were married, now tall and full. He thinks about the possibility that he will never see them again, that he will die in America, that his body will be shipped home in a box while his country burns. He enters the embassy and walks to his office, where a stack of cables awaits his attention. The latest from Tokyo is urgent, demanding, impatient. It tells him to present a new proposal, a final proposal, a proposal that the Americans will almost certainly reject. Nomura reads the cable and sets it down. He knows what rejection means. He knows that when he hands this note to Hull, the clock will stop, and the war will begin. He sits at his desk for a long time, doing nothing, thinking nothing, feeling nothing. Then he picks up the phone and calls the State Department to schedule a meeting. The meeting is set for November 20th. The attack will come on December 7th. The camera returns to Saigon, to the harbor where Tran Van Min watches another convoy arrive, this one even larger than the first. The date is November 20th, 1941. The troops disembarking now are veterans of the war in China, hardened men with hollow eyes and efficient movements. They carry themselves with the confidence of those who have survived the worst and expect nothing better from the future. Tran watches them form into columns and march away from the harbor, toward the camps where they will wait for orders. He notices something different about these troops. They carry extra ammunition. They carry maps of Malaya. They carry the certain knowledge that they are going into battle soon. Tran lights another cigarette and watches until the last soldier disappears from view. He has stopped being afraid. Fear requires hope, and Tran has lost hope. He has seen too much, lost too much, survived too much to believe in anything anymore. He finishes his cigarette and walks back to his office, where a calendar on the wall shows the date. November 20th, 1941. 17 days until December 7th. 17 days until the world changes forever. Tran does not know this, of course. He only knows that the ships keep coming, and the soldiers keep coming, and nothing he does will stop them. In the mountains of Formosa, now Taiwan, the pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy's First Air Fleet gather for a final briefing before embarking on the ships that will carry them to their target. The camera shows a young pilot named Takeshi Maeda, 23 years old, from a farming family in Kyushu. He sits in a crowded room with hundreds of other pilots, listening to the briefing officer describe the target in detail. Pearl Harbor. The name means nothing to Takeshi. He has never seen Hawaii, never imagined it, never thought about it until this moment. The briefing officer describes the harbor, the islands, the winds, the currents. He describes the American ships that will be there, their names and classes and locations. He describes the plan of attack, the timing, the signals, the targets. Takeshi listens intently, memorizing every detail, knowing that his life depends on getting this right. He thinks about his mother, who cried when he left for flight school. He thinks about his father, who said nothing, but gripped his hand so hard it hurt. He thinks about his younger sister, who gave him a good luck charm, a small cloth doll she made herself. He touches the doll now, in his pocket, feeling its presence against his thigh. The briefing ends. The pilots file out of the room and walk toward the airfield, where their planes wait in revetments along the runway. Takeshi pauses at the edge of the tarmac and looks up at the sky, clear and blue and infinite. He thinks about the bombs he will drop, the ships he will sink, the men he will kill. He thinks about the possibility that he will die tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that. He thinks about his mother, waiting for news that will never come. Then he walks to his plane and begins his pre-flight checks, his hands moving automatically, his mind already flying toward the target. And in Tokyo, in the Imperial Palace, Emperor Hirohito receives the final report from his military advisors. The date is December 1st, 1941. The report summarizes the situation, the negotiations, the preparations, the plans. It concludes that war with the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands is unavoidable, that Japan must strike now or surrender its position forever. The emperor listens in silence, his face revealing nothing. He asks a few questions, receives a few answers, nods his head. Then he speaks, his voice soft but clear. He says that he approves the decision for war. He says that he trusts his military leaders to do their duty. He says that he prays for the success of their efforts and the safety of their men. The advisors bow and withdraw, leaving the emperor alone in the room. He sits for a long time, staring at nothing, thinking of nothing, feeling nothing. Then he stands and walks to a window that overlooks the palace gardens. The trees are bare, winter having stripped them of leaves. The ground is hard with frost. The sky is gray and heavy with clouds. The emperor looks out at this scene for a long moment, then turns away and walks back into the palace, leaving the window empty, the garden empty, the future empty of everything except what is to come. In the darkness of a Tokyo evening in January 1941, a 56-year-old man sits alone in a small room aboard the battleship Nagato, anchored in Hiroshima Bay. The man is Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet, and he is writing a letter that will haunt him for the rest of his life. The letter is to the Navy Minister, and in it, Yamamoto does something extraordinary for a Japanese officer of his rank and time. He tells the truth as he sees it, without qualification, without flattery, without concern for his career. He writes that if ordered to war with the United States, he will run wild for 6 months, maybe a year. He will win victories, sink ships, seize territory. But after that, he writes, he has no confidence. After that, American industrial power will assert itself, and Japan will lose. He writes these words knowing they could end his career, knowing they could brand him a coward, knowing they could destroy everything he has worked for. He writes them anyway, because he cannot do otherwise. He is a soldier, and soldiers are supposed to tell their commanders the truth, even when the truth is unbearable. He seals the letter and hands it to an aide. Then he walks to the porthole and stares out at the dark water, watching the lights of other ships twinkle in the distance. He thinks about America, the country he came to love despite himself, the country he will now have to fight. He thinks about the friends he made there, the professors at Harvard who treated him as an equal, the naval officers who welcomed him into their homes, the ordinary Americans who showed him kindness he never expected. He thinks about the impossibility of his position trapped between duty and knowledge, between loyalty and truth. He stands at the porthole for a long time, and when he finally turns away, his face is calm, but his eyes are those of a man who has already seen the future and knows it holds nothing but ashes. Isoroku Yamamoto was born in 1884 in the city of Nagaoka, the sixth son of an impoverished samurai family. The camera flashes back to his childhood, to a small house with paper walls and a dirt floor, where young Isoroku learns to read and write by the light of a single oil lamp. His father, Takano, is a schoolteacher who lost his samurai status and stipend in the Meiji Restoration, who now struggles to feed his children on a salary that barely covers rice. The family is poor, desperately poor, but they have something that matters more than money in the Japan of that era. They have honor. They have history. They have the memory of service to their lord. Young Isoroku absorbs this lesson deeply. He learns that a man's worth is not measured by his possessions, but by his duty, his sacrifice, his willingness to die for something greater than himself. He also learns something else, something that will shape his entire life. He learns to read the faces of powerful men, to understand what they want before they ask for it, to navigate the treacherous waters of politics and ambition. These skills will serve him well in the decades to come, but they will also trap him, forcing him to serve masters whose decisions he knows are catastrophic. In 1901, at the age of 17, Isoroku enters the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Itajima. The camera shows the academy as it was then, a collection of gray stone buildings overlooking the inland sea, where young men are transformed into officers through a regimen of discipline, study, and physical hardship. Isoroku excels at everything he attempts, not because he is naturally gifted, but because he works harder than anyone else. He rises before dawn to study, stays awake long after lights out to memorize tactics and techniques. He graduates 7th in his class of 200, an achievement that guarantees him a promising career. But something else happens at Itajima, something that will haunt him for decades. He meets American naval officers for the first time, visiting instructors who teach courses on navigation and gunnery. They are tall, confident, relaxed in ways Japanese officers never are. They treat their Japanese counterparts as equals, not as inferiors. And this shocks Isoroku deeply. He has been taught that Westerners are barbarians, that Japan is unique, that the outside world holds nothing but threats. Now he meets Americans who laugh easily, who ask questions about his family, who seem genuinely interested in his answers. He begins to suspect that everything he has been told might be wrong, or at least incomplete. He begins to wonder what else he doesn't know. The camera moves forward to 1919, to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto arrives at Harvard University for 2 years of advanced study. The America he finds is nothing like the America he expected. It is vast, prosperous, confident beyond anything Japan can imagine. He rides streetcars through cities that never sleep, visits factories that produce more in a day than Japanese factories produce in a month, walks through department stores that sell more goods than exist in all of Tokyo. He also experiences something he never anticipated: friendship. American officers invite him to their homes, introduce him to their families, treat him as a colleague rather than a potential enemy. He learns to play poker, to drink bourbon, to appreciate jazz music. He falls in love with America, or at least with the idea of America. the possibility of a society where individuals matter more than groups, where ambition is rewarded rather than suppressed, where the future always seems brighter than the past. He writes letters home, describing his experiences, careful to avoid anything that might be considered disloyal, but his true feelings seep through despite his caution. He is fascinated, enchanted, seduced by the enemy he will one day have to fight. In 1921, Yamamoto returns to Japan, but the America he carries inside him never leaves. He rises through the ranks, earning a reputation as a brilliant strategist and a fearless advocate for naval aviation. He sees the future of naval warfare clearly, understands that battleships are dying, that aircraft carriers will rule the oceans. He pushes for more carriers, more pilots, more training, often against fierce opposition from older officers who cling to the battleship tradition. He also pushes for something else, something more dangerous. He pushes for realism about American power. In briefing after briefing, memo after memo, he warns that Japan cannot win a prolonged war with the United States. He cites statistics, production figures, economic analyses. He shows that America produces 10 times as much steel, 20 times as much oil, 100 times as many automobiles. He shows that American shipyards can build a carrier in the time it takes Japan to build a destroyer. He shows that the longer the war, the more certain the defeat. His warnings are heard, considered, and ignored. The Army's ambitions in China, the Navy's desire for expansion, the public's hunger for glory, all overwhelm his cautious realism. He becomes a Cassandra, cursed to speak truth and never be believed. The camera shows Yamamoto in 1934, attending the London Naval Conference as a rear admiral. He watches the Western powers maneuver, sees their hypocrisy, their racism, their determination to keep Japan in its place. He listens to British delegates speak of peace while building battleships. American delegates speak of disarmament while planning for war. He returns to Japan with his eyes opened wider than ever, understanding now that the international order is not about justice, but about power, that nations do what they can, not what they should. He also brings back something else, a deep, abiding anger at the way Japan is treated, the way Japanese are dismissed, the way his country is denied the respect it deserves. This anger complicates everything. He loves America, but he hates American arrogance. He respects American power, but he resents American condescension. He is split, divided, torn between two worlds that cannot coexist. By 1940, Yamamoto is admiral and commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, the most powerful naval force in Japanese history. He lives aboard his flagship, the Nagato, surrounded by officers who treat him with awe and subordinates who fear his temper. But those who know him well see something else beneath the surface, a man exhausted by responsibility, haunted by knowledge, trapped by duty. He spends hours playing shogi and poker, games that require strategy and psychology, games that distract him from the weight he carries. He writes letters to geishas he has known, women who ask nothing of him except his presence, women who offer the only peace he can find. He drinks heavily, sometimes alone, sometimes with trusted aides who listen without judging. He knows what is coming. He knows that the Army's ambitions, the Navy's rivalries, the Emperor's passivity, the public's nationalism, are all pushing toward war with America. He knows that when that war comes, he will be expected to lead it, to win it, to achieve the impossible. And he knows with a certainty that never leaves him, that he will fail. In January 1941, Yamamoto receives a visitor aboard the Nagato, a young staff officer named Minoru Genda, who will become one of the architects of the Pearl Harbor Plan. Genda is brilliant, arrogant, obsessed with naval aviation. He has spent years studying the problem of how to attack the American fleet in its home base, how to overcome the defenses, how to deliver a blow that will stun America into submission. He presents his ideas to Yamamoto, who listens in silence, asking questions, probing weaknesses, testing assumptions. When Genda finishes, Yamamoto nods slowly and says that the plan has merit. Then he says something that surprises Genda, something that reveals the depth of his despair. He says that even if the plan succeeds, even if every American battleship is sunk, even if the fleet is destroyed, Japan will still lose the war. He says this calmly, without emotion, as if stating a simple fact. Genda stares at him, unable to respond. Yamamoto waves his hand, dismissing the topic, and turns back to his maps. The planning continues. The war approaches. Yamamoto does his duty, as he always has, as he always will. The camera follows Yamamoto through the months of 1941, watching him at work, at rest, alone, in company. It shows him in meetings with army generals who dismiss his concerns, who speak of spiritual strength overcoming material inferiority, who believe that Japanese willpower can defeat American industry. It shows him listening to these arguments with a face that reveals nothing, a mask he has perfected over decades. It shows him returning to his quarters afterward and sitting alone in the darkness, staring at nothing, thinking thoughts he shares with no one. It shows him writing letters to his children, letters full of fatherly advice and gentle encouragement, letters that never mention the war, the plans, the death that awaits so many young men. It shows him visiting a geisha house in Tokyo, where a woman named Chiyoko plays the shamisen and sings old songs, songs his mother used to sing, songs that carry him back to a simpler time that never really existed. It shows him drinking sake until he can barely stand, then being helped to a room where he sleeps alone, dreaming dreams he will not remember in the morning. In September 1941, Yamamoto receives the final approval for the Pearl Harbor Plan from the Naval General Staff. He is in Tokyo for the meeting, sitting in a room full of admirals who have spent weeks debating the risks, the chances, the probabilities. Some oppose the plan as too risky, too dependent on surprise, too likely to fail. Others support it as the only hope, the only way to strike a blow that might give Japan time. Yamamoto listens to the debate, his face calm, his hands still. When the arguments finally exhaust themselves, he speaks. He says that if the plan is not approved, he will resign his command. He says this quietly, without drama. But everyone in the room understands what it means. The most respected officer in the Navy, the man who built the combined fleet into its current strength, is willing to walk away, rather than accept a strategy he believes is doomed. The room falls silent. The admirals look at each other, at Yamamoto, at the floor. Then, one by one, they nod. The plan is approved. Yamamoto has won, and in winning he has sealed his fate and the fate of his nation. The camera moves to November 1941, to a final meeting between Yamamoto and the pilots, who will lead the Pearl Harbor attack. They gather aboard the Nagato, young men with eager faces and steady hands, men who have trained for years for this moment. Yamamoto speaks to them briefly, formally, telling them that they carry the hopes of the nation, that their mission is vital, that he has complete confidence in their abilities. Then he does something unexpected. He walks among them, shaking hands with each pilot, looking into each face, memorizing each name. When he reaches the last man, a young lieutenant from Kyushu named Takeshi Maeda, Yamamoto pauses. He looks at the boy, really looks at him, seeing not a pilot, but a son, not a warrior, but a child. He grips Takeshi's hand for a moment longer than necessary, then releases it and steps back. He says nothing more. He doesn't have to. The pilots file out, heading for the ships that will carry them to Hawaii. Yamamoto watches them go, standing alone on the deck of the Nagato, the wind ruffling his hair, the sun setting behind him. He knows that many of these young men will not return. He knows that those who do will carry memories that will never fade. He knows that he has sent them to do something terrible, something necessary, something that will change everything. He stands there until the last pilot disappears from view, and then he walks back inside, back to his maps and his plans and his duty, back to the war he never wanted but cannot escape. In the final days before the attack, Yamamoto remains aboard the Nagato, anchored in Hiroshima Bay, waiting. The camera shows him in his quarters, alone, reading a book of poetry his daughter sent him. The poems are old, classical, written centuries ago by samurai who faced death with dignity. He reads them slowly, savoring each word, each image, each emotion. He thinks about his daughter, about her wedding last year, about the grandchildren she will have, about the world they will inherit. He thinks about his sons, one in the Navy, one in the Army, both preparing to fight, both likely to die. He thinks about his wife, Reiko, waiting at home, pretending not to know what he does, pretending not to fear what comes. He sets down the book and walks to the porthole, looking out at the dark water, the lights of other ships, the distant shore where millions of Japanese sleep, unaware that their lives are about to change forever. He thinks about America, about Harvard, about the friends he will never see again. He thinks about the bombs falling, the ships burning, the men drowning. He thinks about the 6 months he promised, the 6 months of victory before the inevitable defeat. He stands at the porthole for a long time, and when he finally turns away, his face is wet with tears he will never acknowledge, grief he will never share, love he will never express. December 7th, 1941, arrives like any other day aboard the Nagato. Yamamoto rises early, performs his morning exercises, eats a simple breakfast of rice and fish. He dresses in his formal uniform, the one with all his medals and decorations, the one he wears only on the most important occasions. He walks to the radio room, where operators monitor the frequencies, waiting for the coded message that will signal the attack has begun. He sits in a chair, waiting, his face calm, his hands still. The minutes pass slowly, each one an eternity. Then, at 3:19 a.m. Tokyo time, the message comes. Tora, Tora, Tora. The code words meaning surprise achieved, attack begun. Yamamoto receives the message without changing expression. He nods once, then stands and walks out of the radio room, back to his quarters, back to the porthole where he has spent so many hours. He looks out at the water, at the sky, at the world that is now at war. He thinks about the young men dying at this moment, Japanese and American, boys who never knew each other, boys who will never know why they had to die. He thinks about the future, the long years of fighting, the millions who will perish, the ashes that will remain. He stands there for a long time, and when he finally speaks, His voice is so quiet that only he can hear. He says that he fears they have awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. He says that this day will be remembered as the beginning of the end. He says these words, and then he is silent, watching the sun rise over Hiroshima Bay, watching the light spread across the water, watching the world change forever. In the frozen isolation of Hitokapu Bay, on the remote island of Itorafu in the Kuril chain, the morning of November 26, 1941, breaks gray and cold over the largest strike force ever assembled in the history of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The camera sweeps across the anchorage, counting the ships one by one, 6 aircraft carriers, the Akagi and Kaga, the Hiryu and Soryu, the Shokaku and Zuikaku, their decks crowded with torpedo bombers and dive bombers and fighters wrapped in canvas against the snow. 2 battleships, the Hiei and Kirishima, their massive guns silent but ready. 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, 3 submarines, 8 tankers, all riding at anchor in waters so remote that no Western intelligence service thinks to watch them. On the deck of the Akagi, a 26-year-old pilot named Kazuo Sakamaki stands at the rail, watching snowflakes melt on the surface of the gray water. He has been here for 5 days, waiting, training, thinking. He thinks about his wife, married only 6 months, pregnant with their first child. He thinks about the letters he writes her every night, letters he cannot mail, letters he keeps in a box beneath his bunk. He thinks about the bombs he will drop, the ships he will sink, the men he will kill. He thinks about the possibility that he will never see his wife again, never hold his child, never return to the small house in Nagasaki where they planned to grow old together. He does not dwell on these thoughts. He cannot afford to dwell. He is a warrior, and warriors do not think about death. They think about duty. They think about honor. They think about the mission. But standing here, alone in the cold, watching snow fall on water, Kazuo allows himself one moment of weakness, one moment of humanity, before he turns away and walks back to his quarters, back to his bunk, back to the waiting. The ships of the strike force arrived at Hitokapu Bay in secret, one by one, over the course of a week in mid-November. The camera shows the rendezvous as it happened, the great carriers sliding through the fog, the destroyers darting among them like sheepdogs guarding a flock. The crews had no idea where they were going or why. They only knew that something big was happening, something secret, something that required them to gather in the most desolate place on earth. On the Kaga, a 30-year-old chief petty officer named Haruo Yoshino writes in his diary by the light of a shielded lamp, recording his observations, his fears, his hopes. He notes the cold, the constant cold that seeps through every layer of clothing. He notes the silence, the unnatural silence of 6,000 men trying to pretend they aren't terrified. He notes the faces of his fellow sailors, young and old, experienced and green, all wearing the same mask of calm professionalism. He writes that he knows something terrible is coming, something that will change everything, something that will make him a hero or a corpse, or both. He closes the diary and hides it beneath his mattress, where it will remain until the ship reaches Hawaii, until the bombs fall, until history is made. Haruo Yoshino will survive the war, will return to his village, will live to be an old man with grandchildren who ask about the war. He will never show them the diary. He will never tell them what he saw. some things are too heavy to share. In Tokyo, on the same day, the strike force gathers at Hitokapu. Ambassador Nomura sits in his office at the Japanese embassy in Washington, reading yet another cable from Foreign Minister Togo. The cable instructs him to continue negotiations, to explore every possibility for peace, to keep talking even as the clock runs out. Nomura reads these words and feels a despair so deep it threatens to swallow him whole. He knows what his government does not say, that the negotiations are a cover, a deception, a way to keep America distracted while the strike force moves into position. He knows that every hour he spends talking to Cordell Hull is an hour the Americans spend not preparing, not warning, not defending. He knows that he is being used, that his sincere efforts for peace are being twisted into tools of war. He sits at his desk for a long time, staring at the cable, then folds it carefully and places it in a drawer. He walks to the window and looks out at the streets of Washington, at the Americans going about their lives, unaware that their world is about to end. He sees a mother pushing a stroller, a businessman hailing a taxi, a group of children on their way to school. He thinks about his own children, grown now, living in Japan, waiting for news that will never come. He thinks about his wife, alone in their apartment, pretending not to know what he knows. He turns from the window and walks back to his desk, where another cable waits, and another, an endless stream of words that mean nothing, that change nothing, that lead only to death. On November 25, 1941, Secretary of State Cordell Hull receives a final proposal from the Japanese government, a proposal so extreme, so unacceptable, that he knows immediately what it means. The camera shows Hull reading the document in his office at the State Department, his face growing darker with each paragraph. The Japanese demand that the United States cease all aid to China, unfreeze Japanese assets, restore oil shipments, and cease reinforcing the Philippines. In return, Japan will withdraw from Indochina, but only after a peace is concluded with China, a peace that Japan will dictate on its own terms. Hull sets down the document and lights a cigarette, his hands trembling slightly. He has spent months negotiating with Nomura, months hoping for a compromise, months believing that war could be avoided. Now he knows the truth. Japan does not want peace. Japan wants surrender. And when surrender does not come, Japan will take what it wants by force. Hull picks up his phone and calls the White House, asking for an immediate meeting with the president. The meeting is set for that afternoon. The decision that emerges from it will change the world. At the White House, President Roosevelt meets with his top military advisors, the men who will lead America through the coming storm. The camera shows them gathered around a table in the Oval Office, maps spread before them, reports stacked beside them. General George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army, speaks first, outlining the vulnerability of the Philippines, the weakness of American defenses, the impossibility of reinforcing before the Japanese strike. Admiral Harold Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, follows, describing the concentration of Japanese forces in Indochina, the threat to Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, the probability of war within weeks. Roosevelt listens, asking questions, probing assumptions, testing conclusions. He knows what his advisors do not say, that America is not ready, that the public is divided, that Congress will not declare war unless America is attacked first. He knows that he is waiting for an attack, hoping for an attack, because only an attack will unite the country behind the war. He knows must come. He does not say this aloud. He does not have to. The men in the room understand. They are all waiting, all hoping, all dreading the moment when the first bombs fall. The meeting ends with no decision, no action, only a grim acknowledgement that the future is no longer in their hands. Back at Hitokapu Bay, the final preparations are underway. The camera follows Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the strike force, as he walks the deck of the Akagi, inspecting his ships, his men, his equipment. Nagumo is 54 years old, a battleship specialist who never fully embraced naval aviation, who commands carriers only because Yamamoto insisted. He is cautious, methodical, skeptical of the entire operation. He believes the risks are too great, the chances of success too slim, the consequences of failure too terrible. But he is a soldier, and he has his orders, and he will do his duty. He stops at the edge of the flight deck and looks out at the anchorage, at the great ships riding at anchor, at the men moving across their decks like ants. He thinks about his wife, waiting at home in Tokyo, waiting for news that may never come. He thinks about his sons, both officers in the Navy, both preparing for war, both likely to die. He thinks about Yamamoto, the man who conceived this plan, the man who forced it through, the man who will bear the ultimate responsibility for its success or failure. Nagumo does not envy Yamamoto. He does not envy anyone who must make decisions that send thousands to their deaths. He turns away from the rail and walks back to his quarters, back to his maps, back to the waiting that seems to stretch into eternity. On November 26th, at 6 a.m., the signal comes. The camera shows the flags rising on the Akagi's mast, the orders flashing from ship to ship, the great anchors rising from the water. One by one, the ships of the strike force get underway, steaming out of Hitokapu Bay into the gray expanse of the North Pacific. On the deck of the destroyer Urakaze, a 21-year-old sailor named Taro Tanaka watches the shore recede, watches the snow-covered hills of Etorofu disappear into the mist. He thinks about his mother, a widow who works in a textile factory to support his younger siblings. He thinks about the money he sends her every month, money that will stop if he dies, money that will leave his family destitute. He thinks about the letters he wrote her, letters full of lies about how well he is treated, how much he eats, how safe he is. He thinks about the letter he will never write, the one that would tell her the truth, the one that would break her heart. He stands at the rail until the shore vanishes entirely, until there is nothing but water and sky and the other ships of the fleet, steaming eastward into the rising sun. The voyage across the North Pacific takes 12 days, 12 days of tension and boredom and fear. The camera follows the fleet through storms and calms, through days when the ships pitch and roll in mountainous seas, and nights when the water is so calm it seems like glass. The men train constantly, practicing their roles, drilling for every contingency. Pilots study their targets, memorizing the shapes of American ships, the layout of the harbor, the approaches and exits. Mechanics tend the aircraft, checking engines and armament, ensuring that every bomb and torpedo will function when needed. Cooks prepare meals from dwindling supplies, stretching rations to cover the extended voyage. Officers pace the bridges, watching the horizon for any sign of discovery, any American patrol, any neutral ship that might report their position. The tension builds day by day, hour by hour, until it becomes almost unbearable. On December 2nd, the fleet receives the coded message that confirms the attack will proceed. The camera shows the radio room on the Akagi, where operators copy the transmission and carry it to Nagumo's quarters. Nagumo reads the message without expression, then nods and hands it back. The message consists of a single phrase, Nitakayama Nobore, meaning climb Mount Nitaka, the highest peak in the Japanese Empire, the code that signals the attack is authorized. Nagumo walks to the bridge and gives the order to increase speed, to maintain radio silence, to prepare for battle. The word spreads through the fleet, from ship to ship, from man to man. Some cheer, some pray, some simply stand in silence, contemplating what is to come. On the Hiryu, a pilot named Shigeru Fujita writes a final letter to his parents, telling them he loves them, telling them he is proud to serve his country, telling them not to worry. He folds the letter and places it in his locker, where it will remain until after the attack, until after he returns, until after the war that will consume him anyway. Shigeru Fujita will die at the Battle of Midway 6 months later, his plane falling in flames into the Pacific. He will never see his parents again. He will never read the letter they wrote in response, the one that arrived after he was gone, the one that said they loved him, too. In Washington, December 6th arrives cold and clear. Ambassador Nomura receives another cable from Tokyo, this one instructing him to deliver a final message to the American government at precisely 1 p.m. Washington time on December 7th. The cable does not explain why the timing matters. It does not have to. Nomura knows. He knows that 1 p.m. in Washington is early morning in Hawaii, the hour when American ships lie at anchor, when American sailors sleep in their bunks, when the attack will begin. He knows that he is being asked to deliver a declaration of war after the war has already started, that he is being used to preserve the fiction of Japanese honor while Japanese bombers slaughter American sailors in their beds. He sits in his office, staring at the cable, and for the first time in his long career, he weeps. Not for himself, not for his country. For the young men who will die, American and Japanese, because their leaders could not find another way. He weeps, and then he wipes his eyes, and he waits for the morning that will change everything. On the evening of December 6th, the strike force reaches its final launch point, 230 miles north of Pearl Harbor. The sea is rough, the carriers pitching and rolling in the swells, but the wind is from the east, perfect for launching aircraft. On the Akagi, the pilots gather for a final briefing, studying their targets, reviewing their assignments, saying goodbye to friends they may never see again. The camera focuses on Kazuo Sakamaki, the young pilot who watched snow fall on Hitokapu Bay. He sits among his comrades, his face calm, his hands steady. He thinks about his wife, about their unborn child, about the house in Nagasaki where they plan to live. He thinks about the bombs beneath his plane, the ships he will target, the men he will kill. He thinks about the possibility that he will not return, that his wife will receive a telegram instead of a letter, that his child will grow up without a father. He pushes these thoughts away. He cannot afford them now. He stands with his comrades, bows to his commander, and walks out onto the flight deck, where his plane waits in the darkness, ready to carry him into history. At Pearl Harbor, the night of December 6th is warm and quiet. The camera shows the great ships of the Pacific Fleet riding at anchor, their crews ashore or asleep, their guns unmanned, Their radar, silent. On the battleship Arizona, a 22-year sailor from Oklahoma named Jack Harrison lies in his bunk, unable to sleep. He thinks about his girlfriend back home, the girl he plans to marry when his enlistment ends. He thinks about the letter he wrote her today, the one describing the beauty of Hawaii, the kindness of the people, the warmth of the sun. He thinks about the future, the life they will build together, the children they will have. He closes his eyes and tries to sleep, but sleep will not come. Something keeps him awake, some premonition he cannot name, some fear he cannot identify. He lies in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the ship, the creaking of metal, the murmur of water, the distant music from a shore leave party. He does not know that in a few hours the Arizona will be a tomb, that he will be one of the 1,000 men entombed within it, that his girlfriend will receive a telegram instead of a letter, that the future he imagined will never exist. He only knows that he cannot sleep, and he does not know why. At 6 a.m. on December the 7th, the first wave of Japanese aircraft begins launching from the carriers. The camera shows the scene from multiple angles. The planes roaring down the decks, the pilots saluting as they lift into the air, the crews cheering as each aircraft climbs safely away. Kazuo Sakamaki is in the third wave, waiting his turn, watching his comrades disappear into the dawn sky. He thinks about his wife. He thinks about his child. He thinks about the bombs he will drop, the ships he will sink, the men he will kill. He thinks about nothing at all, his mind empty, his body moving automatically through the rituals of preparation. Then it is his turn. He advances his throttle, feels the acceleration push him back into his seat, watches the deck fall away beneath him. He is airborne. He is flying toward history. He is flying toward death. He does not look back. At 7:02 a.m., 2 Army privates, at a radar station on the northern tip of Oahu, spot something unusual on their screens. A large formation of aircraft approaching from the north, about 130 miles away. They report their finding to a lieutenant at the information center, who tells them not to worry, that a flight of B-17 bombers is expected from the mainland. The privates watch the blips approach for a few more minutes, then shut down their equipment and go to breakfast. They do not know that they have just seen the Japanese strike force, that they had the power to warn Pearl Harbor, that their report could have saved thousands of lives. They will learn this later, much later, and they will carry the knowledge for the rest of their lives. A weight that never lifts, a guilt that never fades. At 7:48 a.m., the first Japanese planes arrive over Pearl Harbor. The camera shows the harbor from above, the ships neatly aligned, the water calm, the sun just rising over the mountains. Then it shows the faces of the Japanese pilots, focused, determined, executing the plan they have trained for months to perfect. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, leader of the attack, looks down at the sleeping fleet and sees that every prediction has come true. The ships are there. The defenses are down. The surprise is complete. He keys his radio and transmits the coded message that will echo through history. Tora, Tora, Tora. The signal that surprise has been achieved. The signal that the attack will proceed. The signal that the world is about to change. Below, on the decks of the American ships, sailors go about their morning routines, unaware that death is seconds away. On the Arizona, Jack Harrison stands at the rail, watching the sunrise, thinking about his girlfriend, dreaming of the future. He hears a sound, a distant drone, and looks up. He sees the planes, hundreds of them, filling the sky. He sees the rising sun on their wings. He sees the bombs falling, growing larger as they descend. He has time to think one thought, one final thought, before the world explodes around him. He thinks about his mother who told him to be careful. He thinks about his father who fought in the last war. He thinks about his girl, waiting in Oklahoma, waiting for a letter that will never come. Then the bomb hits, and the Arizona erupts in flame, and Jack Harrison becomes one of the 1,000 souls entombed in the wreckage, forever young, forever American, forever gone. In Washington, Ambassador Nomura sits in his office, waiting for the appointed hour. He holds the final message from Tokyo, the one he is to deliver at 1 p.m. He does not know that the attack has already begun, that American sailors are dying even as he waits, that his country has already started a war it cannot win. He looks at the clock on his wall, watching the minutes tick past. 12:30, 12:45, 12:55. He stands, straightens his tie, picks up the message, and walks out the door. He walks through the corridors of the embassy, past the staff who bow as he passes, past the Marine Guard who salutes, out into the street where a car waits to take him to the State Department. He gets in the car and rides through the streets of Washington, past the monuments and museums, past the Americans going about their Sunday, unaware that their world has already changed. He arrives at the State Department at 2:05 p.m., 50 minutes late, 50 minutes after the first bombs fell, 50 minutes after history was made. Secretary Hull refuses to see him. Hull knows what has happened. Hull knows what the message contains. Hull knows that he has been deceived, that Japan has lied, that diplomacy was never real. Nomura stands in the waiting room, holding his message, alone and humiliated and heartbroken. He does not know what to do. He does not know where to go. He only knows that nothing will ever be the same. And in the skies over Pearl Harbor, Kazuo Sakamaki releases his bombs and watches them fall toward the ships below. He watches the explosions, the fire, the smoke. He watches men die, American men, men with families, and dreams, and futures that will never come. He feels nothing. He feels everything. He feels the weight of what he has done settling onto his shoulders, a weight that will never lift, a burden he will carry for the rest of his life. He turns his plane toward the carrier, toward the rendezvous point, toward the future that awaits him. He does not know that future. He does not know that he will survive the war, that he will return to Japan, that he will live to be an old man haunted by memories. He only knows that he has done his duty, that he has followed orders, that he has killed men he never met, for reasons he barely understands. He flies through the smoke and fire, through the death and destruction, through the silence, before the storm that has now become the storm itself, and he does not look back. At 3:42 on the morning of December 7th, 1941, a 33-year-old Navy Chief Petty Officer named Robert Blaine stands watch on the deck of the minesweeper USS Condor, sweeping the channel outside Pearl Harbor for any sign of enemy submarines. The water is calm, the sky clear, the stars bright above the Hawaiian Islands. Robert has been in the Navy for 15 years, since he lied about his age and enlisted at 17, running away from a farm in Iowa that offered nothing but dust and debt. He has served on half a dozen ships, visited a dozen ports, seen more of the world than he ever imagined possible. Now he stands here, in the darkness before dawn, watching the water for threats that seem impossibly distant. Japan is thousands of miles away. The war is in Europe, in China, in places that have nothing to do with Hawaii. Robert is not worried. He is bored. He lights a cigarette and watches the smoke drift away on the light breeze, thinking about the breakfast he will eat when his watch ends, the letter he will write to his mother, the sleep he will finally get after a long night. He does not know that at this exact moment, 230 miles to the north, the greatest naval strike force in history is preparing to launch its aircraft. He does not know that in less than 4 hours his world will end. He only knows the cigarette, the stars, the water, and the long, slow passage of time. At 3:58 a.m., lookouts on the Condor spot something unusual in the water near the channel entrance. A periscope, briefly visible, then gone. Robert and his comrades stare at the spot, waiting, watching, but nothing appears. They report the sighting to the destroyer USS Ward, which begins a search of the area. The search finds nothing. The periscope, if it existed, has vanished. The officers on the ward note the report and file it away, one of dozens of false alarms that occur every month. They do not know that a Japanese midget submarine, one of 5 launched from mother submarines during the night, has just tried to penetrate the harbor. They do not know that this submarine will be found and sunk within the hour. The first Japanese casualty of the battle. The first shot fired in a war that will consume millions. They only know that the report is inconclusive, that the night is dark, that the sea is vast, and that most sightings are mistakes. At 6 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft begins launching from the carriers of the strike force. The camera shows the scene in panoramic detail, the decks of the 6 carriers transformed into cathedrals of noise and motion. On the Akagi, the lead carrier, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, straps himself into his bomber and waits for the signal. He is 40 years old, a veteran of the war in China, a man who has dropped bombs on Shanghai and Nanking and dozens of other cities. He knows what bombs do to people. He knows what fire does to cities. He knows what war does to those who fight it. None of this knowledge changes anything. He has his orders. He has his duty. He has his place in history, whether he wants it or not. The signal comes. The first bomber roars down the deck, lifts into the air, and begins circling, waiting for the rest of the formation to join. One by one, the planes follow, until the sky above, the strike force, is filled with aircraft, 183 of them in the first wave, forming up by type and squadron, preparing for the long flight south. Fuchida looks down at the carriers, at the tiny figures of men waving from the decks, at the vast expanse of the Pacific stretching in all directions. He thinks about his wife, waiting at home in Tokyo, waiting for news that will not come for many hours. He thinks about his children, who will learn what their father did from newspapers and history books. He thinks about the Americans below, sleeping in their beds, unaware that death is falling from the sky. Then he turns his attention to the formation, to the navigation, to the mission. There is no room for thought now. There is only action. At 6:30 a.m., the USS Ward locates the midget submarine that tried to enter the harbor hours earlier. The camera shows the destroyer maneuvering into position, its crew at battle stations, its guns trained on the water. The submarine is submerged, trying to escape, but the Ward's sonar holds it fast. The captain gives the order to fire. The depth charges roll off the stern, splashing into the water, sinking toward their target. Seconds pass. Then the explosions, muffled by depth, sending plumes of water into the air. The submarine surfaces briefly, damaged and dying, and the ward's guns open fire, punching holes in its hull. The submarine sinks, taking its two-man crew to the bottom. The ward radios a report to headquarters. We have attacked, fired upon, and sunk a submarine operating in the defensive sea area. The message travels through channels, passing from watch officer to duty officer to commander, each man noting it, filing it, passing it along. No one acts on it. No one raises the alarm. The submarine is dealt with. The threat is over. The mourning continues. No one knows that the submarine was only the beginning. At 7 a.m., the radar station at Opana Point, on the northern tip of Oahu, goes online for its daily training exercise. Two young Army privates, George Elliott and Joseph Lockard, man the equipment, watching the screens for any sign of aircraft. They are tired, bored, eager for their shift to end. At 7:02, the screen lights up with a signal so large that both men stare at it in disbelief. The blip shows a massive formation of aircraft approaching from the north, about 130 miles away. Elliott and Lockard check their equipment, verify the reading, and call the information center at Fort Shafter. The lieutenant on duty, a man named Kermit Tyler, receives the report and considers it for a moment. He knows that a flight of B-17 bombers is expected from the mainland this morning. He knows that the radar is new and sometimes unreliable. He tells the privates not to worry, that the blip is probably the B-17S, that they should continue their training. Elliott and Lockard accept this explanation and watch the blips approach for a few more minutes, then shut down the equipment and head for breakfast. They do not know that they have just seen the Japanese strike force. They do not know that they had the power to warn Pearl Harbor. They will learn this later, and they will carry the knowledge for the rest of their lives. A weight that never lifts, a guilt that never fades. At 7:15 a.m., the Japanese strike force completes its formation and turns south toward Oahu. The pilots can see the island now, a green smudge on the horizon, growing larger with each passing minute. Kazuo Sakamaki, the young pilot from Kyushu, flies in the third wave, his bomber loaded with armor-piercing bombs modified from battleship shells. He thinks about his wife, pregnant with their first child. He thinks about the letters he writes her every night, letters he cannot mail, letters he keeps in a box beneath his bunk. He thinks about the possibility that he will not return, that his child will grow up without a father, that his wife will receive a telegram instead of a letter. He pushes these thoughts away. He cannot afford them now. He focuses on the formation, on the navigation, on the approaching target. The island grows larger. The mountains rise from the sea. The city of Honolulu spreads along the coast, still sleeping, still unaware. And beyond Honolulu, hidden behind the mountains, lies Pearl Harbor, where the American fleet waits at anchor, waiting for the blow that will come at any moment. At 7:48 a.m., the first Japanese planes arrive over Pearl Harbor. The camera shows the harbor from above, a panorama of destruction waiting to happen. The ships are aligned in perfect rows, battleship row along the southeast shore of Ford Island. The great ships tied together in pairs, their crews asleep or at breakfast, their guns unmanned, their decks quiet. The water is calm, reflecting the morning sun. The sky is clear, dotted with a few scattered clouds. It is a postcard, a painting, a dream. Then the first bombs fall. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, circling above the harbor in his bomber, watches the attack unfold below him. He sees the torpedo planes drop low over the water, skimming the surface, releasing their weapons into the shallow harbor. He sees the torpedoes run true, striking the battleships anchored along Ford Island, sending plumes of water into the air. He sees the dive bombers plummet from the sky, releasing their bombs on the airfields, destroying rows of parked aircraft before they can rise to defend. He sees the fighters strafing the runways, the hangars, the barracks, killing men before they can reach their posts. He watches all of this and feels nothing, or feels everything, or feels something in between that he cannot name. He keys his radio and transmits the coded message that will echo through history. Torah, Torah, Torah. The code words meaning surprise achieved, attack begun. He transmits this message knowing that it will be heard in Tokyo, that Yamamoto will receive it, that the war has now begun in earnest. Then he turns his attention back to the battle below, to the ships burning, the men dying, the history being made. On the battleship, USS Oklahoma, a 23-year-old sailor from Texas named James DeWitt lies in his bunk, half asleep, dreaming of home. He is a gunner's mate, assigned to one of the ship's 5-inch batteries. But right now, he is just a young man, enjoying the luxury of sleeping in on a Sunday morning. The first explosions shake the ship, throwing him from his bunk onto the deck. He lies there, confused, disoriented, unable to understand what is happening. Then the ship lurches again, harder this time, and he hears the sound of water rushing into compartments below. He scrambles to his feet, pulls on his trousers, and runs for his battle station. The corridors are chaos, men running in all directions, alarms sounding, lights flickering. He reaches the main deck just as the ship begins to list, just as another torpedo strikes, just as the world turns upside down. The Oklahoma is capsizing, rolling over on its side, trapping hundreds of men inside. James jumps into the water, swims away from the sinking ship, and watches as the great vessel turns turtle, its bottom rising into the air, its crew still trapped within. He treads water, surrounded by burning oil, by debris, by other survivors, and he weeps. He weeps for his shipmates, for his ship, for himself. He will survive the war, will return to Texas, will live to be an old man with grandchildren who ask about Pearl Harbor. He will never tell them what he saw. He will never tell anyone. Some things are too terrible to share. On the battleship USS Arizona, the situation is even worse. The camera shows the great ship as it was minutes before the attack, its crew going about their morning routines, its decks quiet, its guns silent. Then, the bombs begin to fall. At 8:06 a.m., a Japanese armor-piercing bomb strikes the Arizona near the No. 2 turret, penetrating the deck and igniting the ship's forward magazine. The explosion is cataclysmic, lifting the ship out of the water, tearing it apart from within. A column of fire rises thousands of feet into the air, visible for miles. Debris rains down on the harbor, on other ships, on the water. The Arizona settles back into the water, broken and burning, its forward section destroyed, its crew decimated. Of the 1,512 men on board, 1,177 will die. The greatest loss of life on any ship in American naval history. Among them is Jack Harrison, the young sailor from Oklahoma, who stood at the rail watching the sunrise, dreaming of his girlfriend, imagining a future that will never come, He is gone now, incinerated in the explosion, his body never recovered, his name etched on a memorial that will stand above his tomb for all time. On the airfields around Pearl Harbor, the destruction is equally complete. The camera shows Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, Bellows Field, Iwo Marine Corps Air Station, all under simultaneous attack. Japanese fighters and bombers sweep over the runways, destroying aircraft where they sit, parked in neat rows to prevent sabotage. American pilots race for their planes, but most never reach them. American gunners scramble for their anti-aircraft positions, but most never get there. The aircraft burn, row after row, hundreds of them, the backbone of American air power in the Pacific, reduced to twisted metal and black smoke in minutes. A young lieutenant named George Welch manages to get his P-40 fighter into the air, dodging Japanese planes as he takes off, shooting down 2 before running out of ammunition. He is one of the few, one of the lucky, one of the ones who fights back. Most simply die where they stand, killed by bullets or bombs or fire, their bodies scattered across the runways they were supposed to defend. In Honolulu, civilians watch the attack from their homes and offices, unable to comprehend what they are seeing. The camera shows a woman named Martha Chung, a 35-year-old Korean immigrant who runs a small laundry with her husband. She hears the explosions, sees the smoke rising from Pearl Harbor, and thinks at first that it is a training exercise, a movie being filmed, some kind of mistake. Then she sees the planes with the red suns on their wings, and she knows. She knows that war has come, that her life will never be the same, that everything she has built is now at risk. She gathers her children, her 2 young sons, and takes them to the basement, where they huddle together, listening to the explosions, praying for it to end. Her husband is at the laundry, miles away, and she does not know if he is alive or dead. She holds her children and waits, and the waiting is the hardest part. At 8:17 a.m., the destroyer USS Helm, patrolling the harbor entrance, spots another Japanese midget submarine trying to enter. The Helm opens fire, scoring hits on the conning tower, forcing the submarine to run aground on a reef. The 2 crewmen inside, Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki and Petty Officer Kyoji Inagaki, struggle to free their vessel, but it is hopeless. They abandon ship, swimming for shore through waters thick with oil and debris. Inagaki drowns, his body never found. Sakamaki reaches shore, exhausted and unconscious, where he is captured by Hawaiian National Guardsmen the next morning. He becomes the first Japanese prisoner of war captured by American forces. He will spend the rest of the war in prison camps, filled with shame at his failure, haunted by the knowledge that he was supposed to die for his emperor, and did not. He will return to Japan after the war, will build a new life, will write a book about his experiences. But he will never escape the moment when he chose life over death, survival over honor, and the choice that saved him also destroyed him. At 8:50 a.m., the second wave of Japanese aircraft arrives over Pearl Harbor. 171 planes, fresh from the carriers, ready to continue the destruction. The first wave, low on fuel and ammunition, turns north toward the rendezvous point, leaving the second wave to finish the job. The second wave focuses on the ships that survived the first attack, on the dry docks and repair facilities, on the oil storage tanks that hold the fleet's fuel. The bombing continues, the strafing continues, the dying continues. On the battleship USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, crewmen fight to save their ship, maneuvering through the narrow channel, drawing fire from dozens of Japanese planes. The Nevada takes hit after hit, bombs and bullets tearing through its decks, but it keeps moving, keeps fighting, keeps refusing to die. Finally, fearing that the sinking ship will block the channel, the captain orders it beached, run aground near the harbor entrance. The Nevada settles into the mud, its crew still fighting, its guns still firing, its spirit unbroken. It will be repaired, will fight again, will survive the war. But on this day, it is just another casualty, just another ship burning, just another piece of the nightmare. At 9:45 a.m., the last Japanese planes depart, turning north toward their carriers, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable destruction. The camera surveys the harbor from above, showing the full extent of the damage. 8 battleships lie sunk or damaged, their masts protruding from the water, their decks awash in flames. 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers are also damaged, some beyond repair. 240 American aircraft are destroyed, another 150 damaged. 2,403 Americans are dead, another 1,178 wounded. The dead include sailors and soldiers, Marines and airmen, civilians and children. They include Jack Harrison on the Arizona, and hundreds like him, young men with families and dreams and futures that will never come. They include mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, sons and daughters. They include people who woke up that morning expecting a normal Sunday, who went to church or slept in or wrote letters home, who never imagined that their lives would end before the day was done. On the decks of the Japanese carriers, the pilots return in waves, their faces showing a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. They are greeted by cheering crews, by officers who shake their hands, by comrades who slap their backs. They have done it. They have achieved the impossible. They have destroyed the American fleet. Commander Fuchida lands last, his bomber damaged by anti-aircraft fire, his body exhausted by hours of combat. He climbs from his plane and walks across the flight deck, accepting the congratulations of his comrades, nodding at their praise. He reaches his quarters and sits alone, staring at nothing. He thinks about what he has seen, the ships burning, the men dying, the water filled with bodies. He thinks about the message he transmitted, the words that will echo through history. He thinks about the future, the war that has just begun, the millions who will die before it ends. He does not feel like a hero. He does not feel like a victor. He feels like a man who has done something terrible, something necessary, something that will haunt him for the rest of his life. He sits alone in his quarters, and he does not move for a very long time. In Washington, Ambassador Nomura arrives at the State Department at 2:05 p.m., 50 minutes after the attack began, carrying the final message from Tokyo. Secretary Hull refuses to see him, but Nomura waits, hoping, praying, knowing that it is too late. Finally, Hull agrees to meet, and Nomura is ushered into his office. Hull is furious, his face red, his hands shaking. He looks at Nomura, at the man he has negotiated with for months, the man he believed was sincere, the man who has just delivered the greatest diplomatic deception in history. Hull speaks, his voice cold, controlled, devastating. He says that in all his 50 years of public service, he has never seen a document more crowded with infamous falsehoods and distortions. He says that he cannot believe that any government could be so duplicitous. He says these words, and then he turns away, dismissing Nomura without another glance. Nomura stands there, holding his message, alone and humiliated and heartbroken. He does not know what to do. He does not know where to go. He only knows that nothing will ever be the same. In Tokyo, the news of the attack spreads through the city like wildfire. The camera shows crowds gathering outside the imperial palace, cheering, waving flags, singing songs. They do not know that they are cheering their own destruction. They do not know that the attack has awakened a giant, that America will not forget, that the war will come home to them in ways they cannot imagine. A young woman named Yuki Tanaka, 22 years old, watches the celebrations from her apartment window. Her brother serves in the Navy, on a ship somewhere in the Pacific. She does not know where he is, whether he is alive, whether she will ever see him again. She watches the crowds and feels nothing, or feels too much, or feels something in between that she cannot name. She turns from the window and walks to her small kitchen, where she begins preparing dinner, the same dinner she prepares every night, as if nothing has changed. But everything has changed. Everything will change, and nothing will ever be the same. On the deck of the USS Arizona, the fires still burn, the smoke still rises, the bodies still float in the oily water. A salvage diver, named Edward Raymer, 28 years old, prepares to descend into the wreckage, to begin the grim work of recovering the dead. He has done this before, on other ships, in other harbors. He has never done anything like this. He puts on his diving suit, his helmet, his weights, and steps off the side into the water. He descends through layers of oil and debris, through darkness and silence, into the tomb of the Arizona. He sees them there, the dead, floating in the compartments, their faces calm, their eyes open, their bodies untouched by the fire that consumed the ship above. He reaches out and touches one, a young man, barely old enough to shave, and he thinks about his own brother, serving somewhere in the Atlantic, still alive, still fighting, still hoping. He does not cry. He cannot cry. He has work to do. He begins the recovery, body by body, compartment by compartment, day by day. It will take months. It will take years. It will take the rest of his life. And when it is done, he will carry the memory with him always, the faces of the dead, the silence of the deep, the weight of what he has seen. He will carry it until he dies, and then he will carry it no more. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, as the last Japanese planes disappear over the horizon and the smoke continues to rise from the harbor, the island of Oahu descends into a chaos that defies description. The camera moves through the streets of Honolulu, where civilians emerge from their homes to stare at the columns of black smoke rising from Pearl Harbor, their faces showing confusion, fear, disbelief. A schoolteacher named Margaret Hickson, 42 years old, stands on her front porch with her 2 young children, watching the smoke, listening to the distant explosions that still echo across the water. She thinks about her husband, a Navy Chief Petty Officer serving on the USS Helena, and she does not know if he is alive or dead. She thinks about the children, who ask questions she cannot answer, who look to her for protection she cannot provide. She takes them inside and turns on the radio, hoping for news, for guidance, for anything that will tell her what to do. The radio broadcasts static, then music, then static again. No one knows what to say. No one knows what has happened. No one knows that the world has just changed forever. At Pearl Harbor itself, the survivors emerge from the wreckage, blinking in the sunlight. trying to comprehend what they have survived. The camera shows them climbing from overturned ships, swimming through burning oil, crawling across debris-strewn docks. They are burned and bleeding and broken, but they are alive. A young sailor named Thomas McGuire, 19 years old, from a small town in Pennsylvania, sits on the edge of a dock, staring at nothing. He was on the USS Oklahoma when it capsized, trapped in a compartment with a dozen other men, breathing through a pocket of air as the ship turned over. They waited for hours, listening to the sounds of battle above, the explosions, the screams, the silence. Finally, rescue crews cut through the hull and pulled them out, one by one. Thomas does not know how many of his shipmates survived. He does not know how many died. He only knows that he is alive, and that being alive feels like a betrayal. He sits on the dock, watching the smoke rise from the Arizona, and he does not move for a very long time. At the Naval Hospital, the wounded arrive in a steady stream, carried on stretchers, supported by comrades, walking on their own if they can. The camera shows the emergency room, transformed into a triage center, where doctors and nurses work around the clock, operating on the wounded, treating the burned, comforting the dying. A nurse named Eleanor Watson, 31 years old, from Boston, moves from patient to patient, doing what she can, knowing it will never be enough. She stops beside a young sailor no more than 18, his face burned beyond recognition, his breath coming in ragged gasps. She holds his hand as he dies, feeling his grip weaken, his life slip away. She does not know his name. She will never know his name, but she will remember him for the rest of her life. The boy who died holding her hand, the boy who could have been her brother, her son, her love. She moves to the next patient, and the next, and the next, doing what she can, knowing it will never be enough. In Honolulu, rumors spread faster than fire. The Japanese are coming. They have landed on the North Shore. They are parachuting into the city. They have poisoned the water supply. The camera shows civilians fleeing their homes, packing cars with belongings, heading for the hills. It shows military police setting up roadblocks, stopping vehicles, demanding identification. It shows blackout curtains going up in windows, air raid wardens taking their posts, the entire island preparing for an invasion that will never come. A Japanese-American storekeeper named Hiroshi Tanaka, 45 years old, a legal resident of the United States for 20 years, watches his neighbors pile into cars and drive away. He has lived here since he was 25, built a business, raised a family, paid his taxes. Now his neighbors look at him with suspicion, with fear, with hatred. He closes his store and goes home to his wife and children, wondering what will happen next. He does not know that within months he and his family will be sent to an internment camp, stripped of their property, their freedom, their dignity. He does not know that his loyalty will count for nothing, that his citizenship will mean nothing, that his life will be destroyed by the war he had no part in starting. He only knows that his neighbors are gone, and the streets are empty, and the future is dark. In Washington, the news of the attack reaches the White House at 2:30 p.m. Washington time, just as President Roosevelt is finishing lunch in his study. The camera shows the president, his face grave, receiving the telephone call from Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox. Roosevelt listens, asks a few questions, then hangs up. He sits for a moment, his expression unreadable, then turns to his aide and says that this means war. He begins dictating a message to Congress, a message that will become one of the most famous speeches in American history. He chooses his words carefully, deliberately, knowing that they will be heard by millions, that they will shape the nation's response, that they will echo through the ages. He dictates, "Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan." He pauses, considers the phrase, nods, and continues. The words flow from him, simple and powerful, capturing the outrage and sorrow of a nation. He finishes the dictation and leans back in his chair, exhausted. He knows what comes next. He knows that he must lead the nation through a war that will last years, cost millions of lives, change the world forever. He knows that he may not live to see the end. He knows all of this, and he accepts it, because he has no choice. He is the president. He is the leader. He is the one they look to in times of crisis. And this is the greatest crisis America has ever faced. On the evening of December 7th, Americans gather around their radios, listening for news, waiting for word from their leaders. The camera shows a living room in Des Moines, Iowa, where a family of 5 huddles around the radio, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of the vacuum tubes. The father, a farmer named William Jensen, served in the Great War, saw combat in France, came home with memories he never speaks of. Now he listens to the news from Hawaii, the reports of death and destruction, and he knows that his sons will have to fight. He looks at them, ages 16 and 14, too young for this war, but not too young for the next one. Not too young for the war that will come if this one lasts long enough. He reaches out and touches his wife's hand, feeling her tremble, feeling his own fear mirrored in her eyes. They listen together, this family in Iowa, this family in thousands of towns across America, this family that will be transformed by the war, that will send sons and daughters to fight, that will sacrifice and suffer and endure. They listen and they wait, and they do not know what comes next. In Tokyo, the celebrations continue through the night. The camera shows crowds in the streets, waving flags, singing patriotic songs, cheering the victory. A young factory worker named Hideki Yamamoto, 23 years old, watches the celebration from a street corner, feeling a mixture of pride and dread. He works in an aircraft factory, building the planes that just destroyed the American fleet. He knows how hard he works, how many hours he puts in, how much effort goes into each plane. He also knows that America has more factories, more workers, more resources than Japan could ever hope to match. He knows this because his supervisors tell him, warning him that they must work harder, produce more, sacrifice everything to keep up with the enemy. He watches the celebration and wonders if they are celebrating victory or celebrating their own destruction. He does not know. He cannot know. He only knows that tomorrow he will go back to the factory, back to the work, back to the war that has just begun. On December 8th, President Roosevelt addresses a joint session of Congress, asking for a declaration of war against Japan. The camera shows the scene in the House chamber, packed with senators and representatives, Supreme Court justices, cabinet members, diplomats. Roosevelt enters slowly, leaning on the arm of his son James, his polio making every step an effort. He reaches the rostrum and grips it firmly, his face set, his eyes hard. He begins to speak, his voice clear and strong, reaching every corner of the chamber. He describes the attack, the losses, the treachery. He calls December 7th a date which will live in infamy. He asks Congress to declare that a state of war exists between the United States and Japan. The chamber erupts in applause, in cheers, in shouts of support. The vote comes quickly, unanimously in the Senate, with only one dissenting vote in the House. America is at war. America will fight. America will win. The camera follows Roosevelt as he leaves the chamber, walking slowly down the aisle, accepting the applause of the legislators who moments ago opposed his every move. The isolationists, the pacifists, the opponents of intervention, all now united behind him, all now committed to the war. Roosevelt reaches the door and pauses, looking back at the chamber, at the men and women who have just given him the power to lead the nation through the greatest conflict in its history. He nods once, then turns and walks out, into the corridor, into the future, into the war that will consume the next 4 years of his life and the lives of millions of others. In the days that follow, America mobilizes for war with a speed and determination that surprises even its leaders. The camera shows factories converting from civilian to military production, assembly lines that once made cars now making tanks, workers who once built refrigerators now building bombers. It shows young men lining up at recruiting stations, eager to serve, eager to fight, eager to avenge Pearl Harbor. It shows families planting victory gardens, buying war bonds, collecting scrap metal. It shows a nation transformed, united, committed to victory at any cost. A woman named Rose McCarthy, 38 years old, from Chicago, watches her husband leave for basic training, her 2 sons too young to fight, but not too young to understand. She stands at the train station, waving goodbye, holding back tears, wondering if she will ever see him again. She does not know that he will survive the war, that he will come home, that they will grow old together. She only knows that he is gone, and the war is just beginning, and the future is uncertain. In Japan, the military leaders celebrate their victory, but some of them already know the truth. The camera shows Admiral Yamamoto aboard his flagship, the Nagato, receiving reports of the attack's success. His staff celebrates around him, but Yamamoto sits quietly, his face revealing nothing. He thinks about the 6 months he promised, the 6 months of victory before the inevitable defeat. He thinks about the American carriers that escaped destruction, the ones that were at sea during the attack, the ones that will one day return to seek revenge. He thinks about the industrial might of the United States, the factories that are even now converting to war production, the ships and planes and tanks that will pour forth in numbers Japan cannot match. He thinks about all of this, and he knows that Pearl Harbor, for all its success, has not won the war. It has only delayed the defeat. It has only made the inevitable more terrible. He sits alone in his quarters, staring at nothing, and he does not move for a very long time. In the waters of Pearl Harbor, the salvage operations continue day after day, week after week. The camera shows divers descending into the wreckage, recovering bodies, retrieving equipment, preparing the ships for repair. On the USS Arizona, the work is impossible. The ship is too damaged, too broken, too full of dead. It will remain where it is, a tomb for more than 1,000 men, a memorial for generations to come. A young sailor named Robert Campbell, 22 years old, assists in the recovery efforts, pulling bodies from the water, identifying them when possible, preparing them for burial. He works 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, until he can no longer remember what it felt like to be anything other than exhausted, anything other than haunted. He will survive the war, will return to his hometown in Ohio, will marry his high school sweetheart, will raise a family. But he will never forget the faces of the dead, the weight of their bodies, the silence of their final resting place. He will carry Pearl Harbor with him always, a burden he can never set down, a memory that will never fade. And across America, in thousands of towns and cities, families receive the telegrams that begin with the words, "We regret to inform you." The camera shows a house in a small town in Nebraska, where a mother opens the front door to find a Western Union messenger boy holding an envelope. She takes it, thanks him, closes the door. She stands in her hallway, holding the telegram, knowing what it contains without opening it. Her son, her only son, was on the Arizona. She has not heard from him since December 6th. She knows, with a mother's certainty, that he is gone. She opens the telegram and reads the words, and the words confirm what she already knows. Her son is dead. Her son is gone. Her son will never come home. She stands in the hallway, holding the telegram, and she does not cry. She cannot cry. The grief is too deep, too vast, too overwhelming for tears. She simply stands there, holding the telegram, as the afternoon light fades and the shadows lengthen and the world continues to turn, indifferent to her loss, indifferent to the millions of losses that will follow, indifferent to everything except the slow, relentless passage of time. In the cold gray light of January 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stands on the bridge of his flagship, the battleship Nagato, watching the waves of the inland sea roll past. The news from the front is good, better than anyone dared hope. Since Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces have swept through Southeast Asia like a tide, overwhelming everything in their path. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day, the British garrison surrendering after a hopeless defense. Manila followed in early January, American and Filipino troops retreating to the Bataan Peninsula. Singapore, the impregnable fortress, is under siege, its fall expected any day. The Dutch East Indies, with their precious oil, are being carved up by Japanese amphibious forces. The perimeter Yamamoto dreamed of, the defensive ring that would protect the conquered territories, is taking shape. His staff celebrates each victory, toasting the success of the plan, the brilliance of the strategy, the courage of the men. Yamamoto accepts their congratulations with a slight nod, a thin smile, but inside he feels nothing but dread. He knows that each victory brings Japan closer to defeat. He knows that the longer the war continues, the more certain the outcome becomes. He knows that the Americans are not surrendering, not negotiating, not doing anything except building the greatest war machine the world has ever seen. He stands on the bridge, watching the waves, and he waits for the moment when the tide will turn. In the waters off Malaya, the British battleships, Prince of Wales and Repulse, lie on the bottom, sunk by Japanese aircraft in the first days of the war. The camera shows the wreckage, the twisted metal, the oil still seeping from ruptured tanks. The sinking of these two ships, the pride of the Royal Navy in Asia, sent shockwaves through the Allied world. If battleships could not survive without air cover, then nothing was safe. The Japanese pilots who sank them returned to their carriers as heroes, their faces young, their eyes bright with the thrill of victory. One of them, a 24-year-old pilot named Takeshi Nakai, sits in his quarters after the mission, writing a letter to his mother. He tells her about the attack, the ships burning, the men drowning. He tells her that he did his duty, that he served his emperor, that he made her proud. He does not tell her that he vomited after landing, that he could not stop shaking for hours, that the faces of the drowning men haunt his dreams. He seals the letter and hands it to a sailor, who will mail it from the next port. Then he lies down on his bunk and stares at the ceiling, waiting for sleep that will not come. In the Philippines, American and Filipino forces under General Douglas MacArthur fight a desperate delaying action on the Bataan Peninsula. The camera shows the defenders, starving and diseased, holding out against overwhelming odds. They eat monkeys and snakes and whatever else they can find. They treat wounds with whatever supplies remain. They fight with whatever weapons still work. A young American soldier named James Donovan, 22 years old, from a farm in Illinois, sits in a foxhole with his best friend, a Filipino soldier named Ramon Santos. They have been together since the fall of Manila, fighting side by side, sharing what little they have. Ramon talks about his village, his family, the girl he plans to marry when the war ends. James talks about his farm, his parents, the tractor he was saving to buy. They sit in the foxhole, listening to the sounds of battle, and they pretend that the future exists, that they will survive, that everything will be okay. They do not know that within weeks Bataan will fall, that they will be forced to march 65 miles to a prison camp, that Ramon will die on the march, that James will survive only to spend 3 years in hell. They do not know any of this. They only know the foxhole, the waiting, the hope that will not die no matter how many times it is crushed. In Tokyo, the civilian population follows the war news with eager anticipation. The camera shows a family gathered around the radio, listening to broadcasts of each new victory. The father, a shopkeeper named Hiroshi Watanabe, nods with satisfaction as the announcer describes the fall of another Allied position. The mother, Sachiko, listens with her hands folded in her lap, her face showing nothing. The children, a boy and a girl, cheer at each new triumph, too young to understand what victory means. Hiroshi looks at his family and feels proud, feels grateful, feels certain that Japan is winning, that the war will end soon, that everything will work out. He does not know that his son will die in the Solomons, that his daughter will be burned in the firebombing of Tokyo, that his wife will starve in the final months of the war. He does not know any of this. He only knows the radio, the victories, the certainty that his country is invincible. By March 1942, the Japanese perimeter stretches from the Aleutians in the north to the Solomons in the south, from Burma in the west to the Marshall Islands in the east. It is the largest empire Japan has ever possessed, the fulfillment of centuries of ambition. But it is also impossibly long, impossibly thin, impossible to defend. The camera shows a map of the Pacific, the Japanese conquests marked in red, spreading across the ocean like a stain. The logistics of supplying this empire are staggering, requiring ships and planes and men that Japan does not have. The Americans, meanwhile, are building. The camera cuts to American shipyards, where keels are laid for Essex-class carriers, the most powerful warships in the world. To aircraft factories, where production lines churn out thousands of planes every month. To training bases, where young men learn to fly, to fight, to kill. The industrial might that Yamamoto warned about is now fully mobilized, and it is only a matter of time before it strikes back. In April 1942, the Americans strike back for the first time. 16 B-25 bombers, launched from the carrier Hornet, bomb Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The damage is light, but the psychological impact is enormous. The camera shows the raid from the ground, Japanese civilians staring up at the American planes, unable to believe what they are seeing. The planes are supposed to be invincible. The homeland is supposed to be safe. But here are American bombers, flying low over the capital, dropping bombs on factories and schools and homes. The Doolittle raid, as it will be called, shatters the illusion of Japanese security. It also triggers a decision that will haunt Japan forever. The military leaders, humiliated by the raid, decide to extend the perimeter, to capture Midway Island, to draw out the American carriers and destroy them in a decisive battle. Yamamoto opposes the plan, preferring to consolidate, to defend, to wait. But the army insists, the naval staff insists, and Yamamoto, as always, does his duty. He begins planning the operation that will end his life and his nation's hopes. On June 4, 1942, the Battle of Midway begins. The camera shows the opposing fleets, Japanese and American, maneuvering in the vast emptiness of the Pacific. The Japanese have the advantage in numbers, in experience, in confidence. They have defeated everyone they have faced. They have never lost. But the Americans have something the Japanese do not. They have broken the Japanese naval code, and they know exactly what is coming. The American carriers lie in wait, hidden beyond the horizon, ready to strike. The battle unfolds over 3 days, a confused and bloody engagement that will determine the course of the war. The camera shows the Japanese carriers, Akagi and Kaga, Hiryu and Soryu, their decks crowded with planes, their crews preparing for the strike that will crush the American fleet. Then the American dive bombers appear, falling from the sky like angels of death. The bombs strike home, one after another, turning the carriers into infernos. The camera shows the Akagi burning, its flight deck twisted, its crew jumping into the water. It shows the Kaga exploding, torn apart by internal fires. It shows the Soryu sinking, its bow rising into the air before sliding beneath the waves. It shows the Hiryu, the last survivor, launching its own strike, damaging the American carrier Yorktown. But then the American bombers return, and the Hiryu joins its sisters on the bottom of the Pacific. On the bridge of the Nagato, thousands of miles away, Yamamoto receives the news of the disaster. He stands motionless as the reports come in, each one worse than the last. 4 carriers, 4 of the 6 that struck Pearl Harbor, gone, destroyed, sunk. His staff weeps openly, unable to contain their grief. Yamamoto shows nothing. His face is calm, his hand still, his voice steady as he issues orders for the withdrawal. But inside he feels something he has not felt in decades. He feels despair. He knows that Midway is the turning point, the moment when the war shifted from Japanese advance to American advance. He knows that his 6 months are up, that the giant is awake, that the end is only a matter of time. He stands on the bridge, watching the stars wheel overhead, and he thinks about Pearl Harbor, about the sleeping giant he feared to wake. The giant is awake now. The giant is angry, and the giant is coming. In the months that follow, the tide turns irrevocably against Japan. The camera shows the battles in the Solomon Islands, the jungles of Guadalcanal, where American Marines fight and die for a tiny airfield that will become a symbol of Japanese defeat. The fighting is savage, brutal, unrelenting. Both sides lose ships and planes and men at a rate that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. But America can replace its losses. Japan cannot. The American factories churn out new ships, new planes, new weapons. Japanese factories struggle to keep up, hampered by shortages, by bombing, by the sheer impossibility of competing with American industry. A young Japanese pilot, fresh from training, arrives at Rabaul to join his squadron. His name is Kenji Yamada, and he is 19 years old. He has flown for 30 hours total, barely enough to take off and land. He is assigned to a fighter squadron, given a plane, and sent into combat within days. He looks at the American planes, the new Grumman F-6F Hellcats, faster and tougher and more heavily armed than anything Japan has. He looks at his own plane, a Zero, once the best fighter in the world, now obsolete and outclassed. He climbs into the cockpit, starts the engine, and takes off to meet the enemy. He does not return. He is one of thousands. The young men fed into the maw of war, consumed by the machine they cannot stop. In April 1943, Admiral Yamamoto makes his final journey. American intelligence, having broken the Japanese codes, learns that Yamamoto will be flying to Bougainville to inspect frontline troops. They decide to intercept him, to kill the man who planned Pearl Harbor, to strike a blow at the heart of Japanese morale. The camera shows the American P-38 Lightnings taking off from Henderson Field. Their pilots briefed and ready, their guns loaded with tracers. They fly low over the water, avoiding detection, closing in on Yamamoto's Betty bomber and its escort of Zeros. The intercept happens exactly as planned. The Lightnings tear into the formation, shooting down the bombers, killing Yamamoto and his staff. The camera shows Yamamoto's plane crashing into the jungle, burning, destroyed. The man who feared the sleeping giant, who warned against war with America, who planned the attack on Pearl Harbor despite his misgivings, is dead. He is 59 years old. He will never see the end of the war he knew was lost from the beginning. In Japan, the news of Yamamoto's death is withheld from the public for weeks. When it is finally announced, the nation mourns. The camera shows the funeral in Tokyo, a state ceremony attended by thousands, the crowds lining the streets, the military honors, the solemn music. A young woman named Yuki Tanaka, whose brother died at Midway, watches the procession from a distance. She thinks about Yamamoto, about her brother, about all the dead. She thinks about the war, the endless war, the war that consumes everything and everyone. She turns away from the procession and walks home through the empty streets, the silence broken only by her footsteps. She does not know that the war will last 2 more years, that Tokyo will be burned to the ground, that millions more will die. She only knows that Yamamoto is dead, and her brother is dead, and nothing will ever bring them back. The camera moves forward to 1944, to the Marianas, where American forces smash through the Japanese perimeter in a battle so one-sided it is called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese pilots, poorly trained and hopelessly outnumbered, fall from the sky in flames. Japanese carriers, the last remnants of the once mighty combined fleet, sink beneath the waves. Japanese soldiers, defending islands that cannot be defended, fight to the death in caves and tunnels, refusing surrender, embracing annihilation. The camera shows a young Japanese soldier named Takeshi Yamamoto, no relation to the admiral, sitting in a cave on Saipan, listening to the American tanks rumble past outside. He is 18 years old, conscripted 6 months ago, sent to this island with minimal training and a rifle that barely works. He holds a photograph of his mother, the only possession he brought from home. He looks at her face, her smile, her eyes, and he knows that he will never see her again. He hears the Americans calling for surrender, promising food and water and safety. He thinks about his mother, about what she would want him to do. Then he thinks about his duty, his honor, his country. He puts the photograph away, checks his rifle, and waits for the end. It comes soon enough, in a burst of American grenades, in a flash of light, in a darkness that never ends. In 1945, the war comes home to Japan. The camera shows the firebombing of Tokyo, the B-29s flying low over the city, dropping incendiaries that turn wooden houses into infernos. The fires burn for days, consuming everything in their path. 100,000 die, mostly civilians, mostly women and children and old men. The camera shows a young girl, maybe 10 years old, standing in the ruins of her neighborhood, staring at nothing. Her family is gone. Her home is gone. Her world is gone. She does not cry. She cannot cry. She simply stands there, in the ashes, waiting for something that will never come. The camera pulls back, showing the devastation from above, mile after mile of burned-out rubble, the bones of a city, the skeleton of a nation. On August 6, 1945, an American B-29 named Enola Gay drops a single bomb on the city of Hiroshima. The camera shows the city before the bomb, a bustling port with factories and schools and homes. Then it shows the flash, the fireball, the mushroom cloud, rising into the sky. 80,000 people die instantly, vaporized by the heat, crushed by the blast. Thousands more die in the days and weeks that follow, from burns and radiation and injuries that cannot be treated. The camera shows survivors wandering through the ruins, their skin hanging in strips, their eyes empty, their voices silent. It shows a mother searching for her child, finding only a shadow burned into a wall. It shows a man kneeling beside the body of his wife, unable to weep, unable to speak, unable to do anything except stare. 3 days later, another bomb falls on Nagasaki, killing 40,000 more. The war is over. Japan surrenders. The empire that was supposed to last 1,000 years lies in ruins. On September 2, 1945, the formal surrender takes place aboard the American battleship Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay. The camera shows the scene, the deck crowded with American and Allied officers, the Japanese delegation in formal dress, their faces expressionless. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signs the surrender document, his leg withered by an assassin's bomb years earlier, his hand trembling slightly. General Yoshijiro Umezu follows, his face a mask of stone. Then General MacArthur steps forward, speaking to the assembled crowd, to the world, to history. He speaks of peace, of reconciliation, of hope. He says that the guns are silent, that the skies are clear, that a new era has begun. The camera watches him speak, then pans across the bay, to the ruins of Tokyo, to the smoke still rising from the ashes, to the thousands of ships carrying American occupation forces to a defeated land. It settles on a single figure, a Japanese woman standing on the shore, watching the ceremony from a distance. She is old now, or at least looks old, though she is only 40. Her face is lined, her eyes hollow, her hands clasped in front of her. She is Yuki Tanaka, The woman who watched her brother leave for war, who watched Tokyo burn, who watched her nation die. She stands on the shore, watching the Missouri, watching the Americans, watching the future arrive. She does not know what that future holds. She does not know if her children will survive, if her country will recover, if anything will ever be the same. She only knows that the war is over, that the killing has stopped, that the long work of rebuilding must begin. She turns away from the bay and walks back toward the city, toward the ruins, toward the unknown future that awaits. Behind her, the Missouri rides at anchor, its guns silent, its flags flying, its crew watching the sunrise over a world that will never be the same.